Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku was an invisible hero with Kacchan's quirk. Here is short summary. He was about to move on when something caught his eye. Now that it wasn't obscured, it shined in the sun, and like a moth to a flame Izuku was drawn in. Fluttering fingers tenderly pick it up and he examined it. It was as sharp as it was shiny, and he wondered what it was and what it was doing here. Flipping it over, it looked like an ornamental arrowhead. Izuku wasn't really into the habit of taking strange objects home, but it was too compelling to resist. Without another thought, he pocketed it and went on his way. Strange things keep happening when a ghost-like figure continues to appear. But he wouldn't delude himself into believing he has a quirk. It was only a matter of time before this phantom would fade away and he was back to being weak and quirkless, right? Or, Izuku gets a stand and he takes on the world with a friend by his side. Things are a little easier when he has a power no one else can see. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. As soon as the teacher dismissed the class, noise exploded throughout the teenager-packed middle school classroom. After a few moments, the noise level dropped and the ambient chatter faded as footsteps carried the boisterous voices further away. Most had leapt up and evacuated quickly, eager to get home and be done with school for the day. The remaining students trickled out of the room shortly after, not looking back as they walked out with their friends. Midoriya Izuku was still firmly planted in his seat, phone in his hand at the earliest opportunity to check the news on the fight from that morning. It had been a close call, wanting to see the fight, take notes, and not be late for class. But he made it with minutes to spare and a stitch in his side for the effort. It did mean he had to sacrifice taking more detailed notes, but that was something he'd catch up on later. And since now was later, he wasn't going to pass up the opportunity to finish what he started. He'd hate to forget any details. This routine of his happened more often than you'd think. He'd encounter a working hero before school, sit and brew about it all day, then as soon as school was let out for the day he'd remain in his seat and furiously write until his hand was cramped. Then he'd write some more. Most of the time he was alone, but every so often someone would be aware of his presence. So he feels like he really shouldn't be surprised that the moment he pulled out his notebook it was snatched from his hands. "Oi, Deku," Kacchan tsked, waving his notebook carelessly. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but we're not done." Izuku's stomach dropped and his breathing began to stutter as he brought his hands up to try and pacify the blonde. Having his important work in Kacchan's capable hands made him really nervous. In his peripheral vision, he could see two of Kacchan's friends standing behind him and leering. "Is that his diary?" one of them teased before taking a closer look. "What's this? He's taking notes on how to be a hero." The way he said it made Izuku flush with nervous heat. Not a beat later they broke into laughter, calling him pathetic and delusional. Izuku's claims of, "It's not funny," were drowned out. His mouth was automatically running his usual rambling that fell on deaf ears, quite possibly deaf ears. Kacchan's quirk could be loud and he never used it in moderation, so it's possible that his hearing would decline from the exposure as a result, but Kacchan never answered any questions he had, so he would never get confirmation. His eyes were focused on his notebook. His hands were tense and he really wanted to snatch it back, but he wouldn't risk any damage. He had to get it back, preferably before they decided they were going to look through it or worse. The resonating boom of a cruelly placed explosion rang through his ears as it was sandwiched between Kacchan's fiery hands. Something wound up tight inside him, and the sight of his childhood friend, who knew how important that notebook was to him, just being so callous without a second thought. "That's so mean," he whined as a tremor ran through him at the sight of its scorched state. Glowing embers were already eating at the cover, peeling back the thin page, but hey, it looked like it was only the cover. Maybe the pages in between were spared, and if not, it would only be the few pages either side that would be compromised, and that could be easily fixed, and he could just replace the cover instead of the whole boo. And his fingers twitched uselessly as he watched Notebook Volume 13 tumble through the air like a downed bird during hunting season as Kacchan tossed it behind him like an afterthought. Right out the open window. The pages like wings as they fluttered roughly against the wind. Kacchan was speaking, but it was going through one ear and out the other, but Izuku was frozen in place. His eyes focused past Kacchan and out the window. Then there was a weight on his shoulder, a hand, burning through his uniform as Kacchan advised him not to even think about applying to UA. Izuku didn't really know what to do. His eyes felt far too wide as he just stuttered without any idea what to say. Apparently, that was all Kacchan and his friends had come here to do and they were leaving. Not bold enough for the big movements required to move from where he was frozen facing the window, Izuku scrunched his eyes up so he wouldn't see them in the reflection. Every single time he hated how he was unable to move when he was pushed down. The anger of injustice swirled within him, but he couldn't tap into it. Unable to even bark back when someone stronger intimidated him. Though this was the worst thing Kacchan had done so far. By throwing away his hero notes, he was also throwing away Izuku's dream of being a hero. He couldn't hate Kacchan, but if Izuku never saw him again it would still be too soon. So he wouldn't start to cry until they were gone. They were almost out the door when the footsteps stopped. If you really wanna be a hero so bad, there might actually be another way. Kacchan's rough voice spoke up, almost contemplative. Just pray you'll have a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof of the building. Izuku's head snapped around. Had he really just said that? Even as a joke, that was such a vicious thing to say. He almost wasn't surprised to see an equally cruel look on the blonde's face, a few bursts of his quirk flashing across as he held his hand up menacingly and asked if something was wrong. Izuku's body felt like jelly. Thankfully that was it and he was alone again. He waited a few tense moments, partially to recover the use of his body and partially to make sure Kacchan's group had well and truly left, before robotically picking up his bag and stepping out of the classroom. He caught himself looking up as he entered the stairwell, up towards the roof. Kacchan must have been joking a really stupid joke. What if he really killed himself, because the roof access was always locked? No students were allowed up there. So with one hand on the railing and the other clenched around his bag strap, he made his way down the stairs. His thoughts continued brewing as he stalked around the side of the building, just under where his classroom's open window, and kept his eyes peeled. His notebook would have landed here somewhere. There it is. His eyes stung and his throat tightened as he completed his walk of shame, step after step towards his tattered and no doubt ruined notebook bobbing in the opaque water of the courtyard fountain. He swallowed thickly as he willed himself not to give in to his crybaby urges, snatching his book back from the hungry fish. Midoriya Izuku was naturally an optimist. Until he saw the damage, he didn't know if his notebook was beyond recovery. There was a chance the water damage wasn't that bad and he could recover his notes. Alternatively, he's lost it all. But if he could do it once, he could do it again. Sure, he couldn't remember every thought and theory he had spilled into the pages of his notebook, but if he had written it down in a frenzy once, then hopefully he'd think the same things again and maybe even make it better. The fight from that morning. That wouldn't happen again. Watching Mount Lady take down a villain on camera is nothing compared to in person. He was glad he'd actually been there, feeling the ground tremble as she decisively ended the fight. But with so many witnesses there would be so many recordings from so many angles. It wouldn't be the same, but maybe he'd see something he didn't notice earlier. See, it wasn't all that bad. Still, a whisper echoed in the back of his mind, questioning what knowledge would be lost forever, drowned in the quiet ripples of a peaceful pond. His stomach tied itself in knots and he bit his lip as he tried not to think about it. Frustration was vibrating throughout his entire being. If only he was stronger. If only he wasn't quirkless. Then he could fight back. If he had a power he'd use it to help everyone he could, but he couldn't even help himself. Stupid jerk, he muttered as he inspected volume 13. If he was careful with the pages he'd be able to make it last long enough to copy what he could into another book. He was lucky, the damage could have been worse. Something caught his eye. It must have been obscured by the shadow of his capsized notebook, but with the soggy papers in his hand, nothing was stopping the golden glint piercing through the murky water right into his eye, begging to be inspected. Without much thought, Izuku leaned forward and reached into the water. His fingers closed around something roughly the size of his palm. The slightly slimy water clung to his school uniform as he pulled the object out, the soaked fabric past his elbow somehow more black than the rest. He wasn't really sure what it was, or how it came to be in the middle school fountain in the first place. After considering its shape for a moment, Izuku thought it resembled an arrowhead. Surely it was just an ornament of some kind. The edge of the blade was silver, contrasting with its gold body. There were some raised ridge lines in seemingly random but symmetrical shapes and a heart-shaped hole decorating the body. Some muck from the pond still clung to it, making the metal dull. Izuku, too compelled against reason, supposed that meant it had been there for some time and no one would miss it. He slipped it into his pocket, actions taking over his body as his mind drifted elsewhere. Then with one foot in front of the other, he began the daunting task of walking home. If he thought he was going to get an uneventful walk home, he was wrong. So very wrong. First Izuku became a victim of a villain attack. As much as he loves to watch them, he found it much easier to analyze as he watched from a distance instead of being a part of the show. As an avid thrill seeker of the hero versus villain variety, he knew that a hero would show up. Eventually. His grip on time might have not been so reliable when he couldn't breathe and his heart was hammering against his burning lungs. He was too busy fighting uselessly with all his strength and determination and hoping it wasn't the end for him. He didn't expect a hero to show up so soon, though with hindsight the villain's rambles and actions suggested he was already being pursued, and he certainly didn't expect All Might. He was reduced to a flustered mess as All Might stood in front of him in his full glory, villain captured and making sure Izuku was all right. When his brain finally caught up, all his thoughts were crashing forwards at once while his body scrambled to find his notebook so he could get an autograph. It was already autographed. Incredible. All Might really was so cool. And then All Might was preparing to leave. Disappointment shot through Izuku. He'd chalk his next actions up to impulse. Because Izuku was desperate. It wasn't often he got to see All Might in person, albeit from a distance, in a crowd, and now here he was. Right in front of him. The most amazing hero in the flesh with no crow or reporters in the way. He couldn't go yet, he had so many questions. Oh no, he was leaving. Izuku couldn't stop him from leaving, but his body lunged without thought and then he was in the air. They stopped on that roof and All Might was about to take off again. Izuku wasn't about to just on him again. But if he let him leave, he'd never get this opportunity again. He had to ask before he left. Just one question. Not even one about All Might. Just the one question he really needed an answer to. Is it possible to become a hero even without a quirk? His body was stiff in place as All Might stopped. Though the wound-up feeling in his chest stopped him from being relieved that he succeeded in getting his idol's attention, the pause indicated he was going to answer. That pause was dragged out too long. All Might stood by that railing as Izuku clenched his fists and hoped. Well, he didn't get his answer straight away. He learnt about the other side of his idol. It was shocking at first, but he liked to think he didn't react too badly. He got some insight from the #1 hero. Who would have guessed the famous fearless smile had fear behind it? It was very convincing. The public rarely saw the costs of hero work. The injury marking the man's torso was hardly glamorous. But if All Might can still be a hero with even such a horrifying, debilitating injury, then surely Izuku could still save people without a quirk. That's Izuku's optimism. It was all a roundabout way to get back to his question. He got his answer. No, I don't believe you can be a hero without a quirk. It hurt being told his goals should be attainable and realistic. Coming from All Might just made the blow even stronger, more awful and undeniable. No matter how much he wanted to deny it. So he was left all alone on that roof as his mind whirred. What about Izuku's own decision to believe in himself? To keep smiling like the hero that doesn't believe in him? Well, it's not like he doesn't believe in him. Well, he doesn't. It's just he'd rather protect him from a hard and scary job. A job with too much pressure. Izuku couldn't work out up from down at the moment. A whole lot of information and a whole lot of emotions were flooding his brain. Maybe he just needed to take his thoughts off heroes for once. Maybe after a short break, he'd be better at going through everything that just happened. Rationalize it and break it down in his head. Convince himself he still has what it takes. That he can be the first quirkless hero. That he can and will fight for his dream. Yeah, he'd do just that. And then there was a distant rumbling and he watched as a dust cloud kicked up. Instincts took over his body and he was already running towards the chaos. Only to stop himself short when All Might's words flashed in his mind. You can't be a hero without a quirk. Suddenly the passion drained from him and the events of the past hour caught up to him. Maybe he wouldn't seek this one out. He couldn't take any notes in his notebook anyways. In the end, whether he sought out the fight or not didn't make much of a difference. He tried to walk home, flicking through his notebook to take in the full extent of the damage as suffocating words echoed in his head. Tried to stop his eyes from withering up and keep tears at bay. He walked right to the fight and didn't even notice until a series of explosions ricocheted through the urban landscape. He knew they must have been going on for some time, but he had such a habit of denying reality that he just decided it was something else. Izuku was going to keep walking but he recognized the villain. The captured villain from before. Dread settled in his stomach. The heroes were struggling, and the villain had taken another kid hostage. He knew it was his fault. A million, if onlys, were running through his mind as murmurs through the crowd reached his ears. The guilt was eating him alive. He pressed a shaking hand firmly over his mouth. His eyes were stuck forward, focused right on the rampaging villain. He couldn't look away. The blame was all his, and he couldn't do a damn thing to make it right. Even though he really wished he could. All he could do was wait and hope and feel so terribly sorry. And then in a brief moment where the dust wasn't completely obstructing the villain and he turned at just the right angle, Izuku recognized the hostage. He was running before he could even think. Each step thundered through his body and he couldn't bring himself to stop. He had to act. He had to do something. Years of curated notes flashed behind his eyes as he wondered what a pro would do. Just as quickly, it came to him. In a swift movement, he ripped his bag from his shoulder. He ignored how the violent movement caused his arm to brush against the sharp object in his pocket. He didn't feel any pain even as the sleeve of his uniform was torn. Instead, he only felt determination. Every thump of his heart was urging him to fight and try to help. All he wanted was to make a little difference, to buy some time for Kacchan to take a break and for others to act. With as much force as he could, he threw his backpack and hoped it was enough. Thankfully it was enough. His intervention bought Kacchan a few seconds of precious air, and the sheer relief in his eyes said it was just in time. But the villain quickly recovered and reared towards Izuku, who was frozen in place. No one would have ever thought he'd get this far, even himself. But the twitch of his muscles was demanding he do more. He can do more. Kacchan was swallowed by the goop and Izuku stood there with his mind desperately sorting through what his next move should be even as every vibrating cell in his body urged him to fight or duck out of the way and try again. He refused to back down. He was here now and he could fight. He could do what he could to help Kacchan. In the corner of his eye, something flickered, something that wasn't the raging fires or the flash of a camera. But it barely registered in his mind as he instinctively focused on the threat towering over him and preparing to wipe him out. A few things happened at once. Just as the villain moved forwards to end him, arms that were not his own came from him ready to take the blow. In the same breath, All Might came to the rescue, sliding between the two at the last moment and punching him into next week. The villain was apprehended soon after that. The arrival of All Might saw to that. Every fight All Might arrived at was usually wrapped up more or less immediately. But now that Izuku was privy to the secrets All Might preferred to keep out of the public eye, all he could notice was how tired he looked. How much he was pushing it just to be there and keep everyone safe. All Might really was the best hero. But it didn't help with his guilt at all. And Izuku could never be like him anyways. After that, it was the same song and dance that happened after every villain's takedown. The scene was cleared, hostages checked and reporters swooped in. Though usually Izuku only observed this from a distance while muttering feverishly to himself. It was a different change of pace having the heroes lecture him. He supposed that was fair enough. It must have been really stressful for them. They must have been sure he was about to get hurt just before All Might stepped in. Kacchan didn't get chewed out. Rather the opposite. But Izuku supposed that must have been because he didn't choose to get taken hostage, whereas he chose to run past the protective barriers and make himself a target. A dull voice in the back of his head said they didn't suppose anything. He tried not to think too deeply about it, but the words that everyone had been saying to him his whole life were flashing in his mind. Somehow, without knowing him, they had decided he was weak. He stared at the ground and grit his fists. He didn't want to give up, even if that was what he was expected to do. If he was just given a fair chance, he was sure he could show everyone what he's worth. But as he was beginning to think, he'd never be given that chance. If only he had the guts to just take it instead of being a weak Deku. It was nearing golden hour by the time he was walking home. He navigated the narrow streets of his neighborhood on autopilot as his thoughts still brewed. The words spoken to him in the empty classroom. Useless when tangled in sludge. All Might's secrets. All Might's disapproval. His actions when he realized Kacchan needed help. He'd like to apologize to All Might, for what it was worth. He was pulled out of them by a crude voice calling his name. Deku. Well, not his name. But it was for him and he stopped his pace. He listened as Kacchan spilled his rant. It felt a little over the top. He idly thought that somehow a nerve was struck in Kacchan. The way he said the words somehow sounded wrong. Like maybe he was just saying them just to say them. Was Kacchan insisting he didn't help because he actually did help and Kacchan was embarrassed? Izuku didn't think about it too much and just as quickly Kacchan was storming away without hassling him further or expecting a response. Good thing too, Izuku wasn't sure he had a response in him. A bitter smile crossed his face as he reflected on how, even if he didn't help much, he tried his best. I am here. That smile was slapped right off his face as a heart attack slammed through him. His body was immediately sent into fight or fanboy, though he managed to get himself under control fairly quickly before nearly having another heart attack when All Might shrunk down. Thankfully, no one was around to see the number one hero in that compromising state. He would have never predicted why All Might was here. Even if he wasn't shrunken, it'd still be shocking to see the number one hero casually in such a suburban area for no apparent reason. The reason was nothing Izuku could have ever speculated. Not even in his wildest dreams. He would have never guessed he had inspired his idol. He would have never imagined All Might take back his reality check answer to a desperate quirkless boy's question. He would have never thought that a pro would say he had the makings of a hero. He would have never foreseen the words he had so desperately wanted to hear, words his own mother never dared utter, be spoken so surely from his hero's mouth. You can become a hero. Well, today was full of firsts. He was drained, both emotionally and tearfully. He didn't think more tears could be wrung from his raisin-like eyes. They were so dry he wouldn't be surprised if they started to flake away. The entire day felt like a roller coaster and once he stepped off his knees were still weak and his stomach was still doing flips. For all the highs and lows of the roller coaster, the best part was definitely the rush right before the ride stopped. The part that made the fear of heights all worth it as adrenaline coursed through your body. Not only was he going to be a hero. All Might said he was going to be a hero. All Might was going to train him. The number one hero, All Might. His mind was stuck in a feedback loop as his body dragged itself through the door. He distantly wondered if he was frothing at the mouth. His exhaustion from the day was evident as his body went through the motions of returning home from school. It wasn't unusual for him to get home later, opting to take a longer detour in hopes of catching a glimpse of a hero in action. His mum wasn't home, which wasn't unusual either. Today he selfishly wished she was here. Despite being tired from the day's events, he wanted nothing more than to hug his mum and spill about his day. Well, at least the bits he could spill. He wouldn't recount the bullying and he'd even downplay the first villain attack. At the very least he wanted to tell her all about meeting All Might as she nodded along encouragingly. But he supposed he'd have to settle for later, whenever she got home. He probably just needed to eat something. There was something left in the fridge for him with a post-it note on it complete with a smiley face and heart. He felt a little guilting knowing he'd have to tweak the best part of his day when she did come home. But it wasn't like he could share any of the secrets All Might had confided. His school bag had been discarded and he was changing his uniform when he realized there was a tear in his sleeve. He shrugged the item of clothing off and inspected it. It was only about medium-sized, nothing he couldn't stitch up and certainly nothing his mum didn't need to know and fret about. There was a matching smudge on his forearm lined with dried blood from the shallow cut. For a moment he wondered when exactly that happened. He didn't have to wonder how for long when he remembered the sharp object he stuffed in his pocket. Izuku pulled the arrowhead out, definitely a real arrowhead, because who'd make jewelry this sharp? And sure enough there were beads of blood faintly staining the edge. He cleaned it against the inside of his pocket and noted the hole from where it had pushed through the fabric. That would need stitching too. He put the arrowhead in his desk drawer and laid his jacket out to rest on the bed. He finished changing and donned an All Might shirt with renewed pride. Okay, one thing at a time. First, he'd clean his arm, then he'd fix his uniform, and then he'd sort out his notebook. See, he was listening when All Might said, attainable goals. Stepping into the small apartment bathroom and turning on the water, he scrubbed the blood off with his nail and washed the evidence down the sink. His hand froze over the tap to turn the water off as he realized that the wound was already healed. Maybe that was why the heroes didn't spend long looking at him over after the fight. Someone with a healing quirk must have made sure he was alright and he just didn't notice. He was so out of it that it was possible. He didn't dwell on it for too long, instead moving on to the other things he needed to get done. Strange things started happening. It started with seeing things that weren't there. His eyes were drawn to movement flickering in the corner of his eyes, but when he turned he found nothing. He chalked it up to hypervigilance from being bullied. His new routine of waking up before the sun to train had him sleep-deprived at best. He knew it would take some time to adjust, but until then each morning his reflexes were less than subpar. A few mornings later, while making a protein-filled breakfast, his arm of lead with the precision of the fourth wheel of a shopping trolley collided with the ceramic bowl and sent it over the counter. Panic filled him as he anticipated the sound echoing through the halls as it shattered and disturbed his mum. But it never came. He jerked on instinct and a moment later it was back on the counter. He didn't know how he had managed it with both hands holding ingredients he never put down, but the coolness tingling on his fingertips suggested he did touch the ceramic. The crisis was averted, so he didn't think much of it at the time. He was too busy fighting to keep his eyelids open. Another morning his run took a little longer than usual and Izuku found himself pressed for time to get ready for school. As he raced through the apartment with everything he needed to do flashing through his mind, it was a moment later that he realized that some things had already been done. His bag was already heavy in his hands, packed with supplies for the day. Izuku had the phantom feeling of doing yet no memory of doing it. However, the results did prove that he did it. Maybe he would go to bed an hour earlier tonight. This new routine was still in the works. His enthusiasm wasn't a good substitute for coffee, and he didn't even drink coffee. Yet, at least, his mum assured him it was inevitable. He really should have documented these strange instances, but with everything changing in his life Izuku was just doing the best he could to keep up. One new development was that Kacchan left him alone. Izuku felt a little guilty to say he appreciated it. He didn't like it when Kacchan turned his fury towards him, but being ignored left him feeling hollow. He decided not to dwell on it. Kacchan's extras picked up on it but didn't get the memo. Izuku was shuffling through the hallway after the bell rang, wanting to get home as soon as possible so he could train with all might. Usually, he waited until the classroom had cleared out, but living in Tokyo had him used to waiting through large crowds. Even so, these crowds could turn hostile and Izuku couldn't help but have his guard up. When a shoulder bumped into his and sent him off course, he grit his teeth and forced himself to not flounder. His arms tightened around his notebook, instantly wishing he hid it in his bag instead of carrying it out in the open when he saw Kacchan's long-fingered extra eyeing him. He held the other boy's gaze and hoped that was enough resistance. If he wanted to prove he deserved to be a hero, he had to be strong enough to fight his own battles. Starting with the ones in his own schoolyard. His fingernails dug into the cover of his new notebook. Determination surged through his veins. He would not lose another notebook. He would not stand by and let anyone talk down to him and dismiss his dreams. He believed in himself, and so did All Might. A few things happened in quick succession. Fingers jerked suddenly towards him. This time, Izuku wouldn't allow himself to flinch away. He took a measured step back to turn his body away and hold his notebook from reach. He wouldn't let anyone take his dream. Even when he was trembling in the face of conflict, he would try his best to stand his ground. Before Fingers could make impact, a figure materialized between them. It had its back to Izuku as it pushed the other boy back. The sudden arrival made him jump back and hit his back against the wall. Shame flooded through him for his cowardly reaction, but his analytic habits quickly overrode and he tried to take in as much as he could about the situation. It seemed Fingers was shoved by a careless student in a crowded hallway. His reaction to being stopped by the figure implied confusion. Did he wonder who was responsible for it? No, the way he stared forward almost like he was seeing past it, could he not see it? The figure was in a defensive stance with its forearms crossed to shield Izuku, and Izuku's own forearms were tingling with light pressure as if he could feel the resistance. He absently rubbed his arms and took a step forward, reaching out to touch the figure. At the same time, Fingers regained his balance. The figure faded into nothing. What the? Fingers looked genuinely spooked. Izuku tried his best not to move so he wouldn't bring Fingers' attention back to him. But he couldn't stop his eyes from darting around and trying to work out whose quirk that was. He couldn't see anyone paying attention to them. Everyone walking past seemed completely oblivious to what happened. But he did see Kacchan striding towards them with his usual displeased glare. Izuku quickly and instinctually darted his eyes away before they could make contact. What do you think you're doing? For a single second Izuku thought that nothing had changed and Kacchan was addressing him. But then Fingers was spluttering something and putting distance between them, and inexplicably, Izuku's posture relaxed. I don't care, let's go. Kacchan barked at his friend and kept walking without a spare glance at Izuku. Fingers have him one last odd look that wasn't quite a glare before trailing after him. Izuku watched them go, one hand still clutching his unscathed notebook and the other limp by his side as his brain worked overtime to make sense of what just happened. While the change in social dynamics and uncertain social hierarchy still had him thrown in a loop, Izuku ultimately decided to ignore it in favor of figuring out what the form that had appeared was. Picking apart that quirk should be easy enough. He sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor and back-pressed against his bed as his eyes roamed all his hero analysis notebooks spread out before him. It wasn't every day he took them all off of the shelf, but he needed as many references as possible to try and piece together what happened. But really, he was just trying to eliminate possibilities. He almost walked into traffic twice on the way home because he was too distracted going over and over it in his head. He already had an idea in his mind, a desperate idea from a discarded dream that he would one day develop a quirk and he could be everything he ever wanted. But there was also logic to consider. It was unheard of to develop a quirk later on. Quirks developed before the age of 4, or 4 at the latest. Izuku being double digits made it an impossibility. But he had undeniably felt a pull towards the figure. Seeing it somehow felt familiar and put him at ease. Of course, that could just be a side effect of whatever that quirk was. He shouldn't get any hopes up. But if it was someone else's quirk, why would they step in now? He'd been pushed around publicly during lunch before with more attention, so why not then? He had already completed a page in his notebook detailing the elements of the incident and a rough sketch of the figure. Too bad he didn't see more of it, but he was sure he had enough. Izuku threw his head back to rest on the bed. There were so many things to consider for both sides. Good thing he knew where to start. In one of his earlier notebooks, he noted the quirk of everyone in the school. It was easy considering the yearbook always had a full, about section of each teacher and student, quirk included. Izuku had excitedly written them all down feverishly. Then he let his imagination go wild and wrote down various imagined applications and limits in which students should team up with which and flicked through the yearbook to catch glimpses of each student and see if he can see a hint of their quirk to add data to his notebook. Of course there was a chance new students had transferred since the yearbook release, but he could go looking if he didn't find anything here. If he found anything with even a slight chance of application in the situation that happened today, he had all his other notebooks to reference to see if it really is possible. If he did find something and connect it to someone, he'd have to see if they were at school today and if they knew what their quirk did. Izuku didn't know if he hoped to find something or not, but the feelings of hope inside him were eating away, not unlike when his peers first started developing quirks. Pushing the hope to the back of his mind and turning on the cold analytic that came to him like second nature, Izuku began going through the list. Izuku's eyes hurt, so bad. His body already hurt from training with All Might, which he'd never complain about. He was proud of those aches and pains, but now that he had stayed up past his bedtime obsessively working through possibility after possibility, his brain had finally caught up with his body's level of fatigue. The only lead he had was a younger student with an illusion quirk. But even then the application was a long shot. Only possible if the quirk had evolved since the last yearbook. The quirk would have had to evolve to have a physical aspect as it held up fingers. And transfer touch to whoever it was protecting, as Izuku's forearms had an unexplainable weight pressed against them. It would also have to change to appear to some but not others, because Izuku had seen it but not fingers. A quirk evolving happens sometimes, but 3 evolutions? Hardly possible. Definitely not a result of another student or teacher's quirk. Izuku was too tired to feel any emotions from his conclusion. He reflexively got ready for bed and crawled under the covers. Though even with his eyes shut his mind didn't stop. Izuku had felt some kind of pull, or kinship. Somehow looking at it felt like a reflection of his desires. But he couldn't believe it was his quirk. Wouldn't. No matter how giddy he felt at having something, he wouldn't delude himself. Why develop now? Why at all? He'd write about it in his notebook tomorrow. Then he'd find a way to eliminate the possibility that it was him. So it turned out he didn't need to scheme to bring it out. He was scheming on his morning run, because he was good at multitasking. He needed to work out and he needed to think, and because he was scheming and distracted he missed a step on a moderately small staircase between housing complexes and nearly toppled face first into the concrete below. Nearly, because when he brought up his arms to protect himself another pair caught him by the shoulders and gently lowered him to the ground. Knowing there wasn't anyone there before he tripped, he whipped his head around. A scream caught in his throat and came out as a stutter. All his cowardly tendencies leapt to take over, urging him to scurry back and make himself small. But he had decided that he wasn't going to be like that anymore, so with a big breath in and out, Izuku calmed down as his brain started processing. The figure didn't move, staring down at him. It was the same one from yesterday, but at least now Izuku could clearly see what it looked like. His analytic gaze wouldn't let him take his eyes off it, as if it was possible to burn the image into his eyeballs while he broke down the components that made the figure. It was humanoid, but also reminded him of a figurine at the joints. It was tall like All Might but all lean muscle. It had a helmet that reminded him of the #1 hero's famous hair but was forest green. Actually, it had a remarkably similar bodysuit color scheme to All Might's, but where red was supposed to be was replaced with green. It had a black mouth guard that looked like the lower half of a motorbike helmet with a shape that reminded him of ectoplasm, covering from the jaw, running under the eyes and over the nose. Connected to that was a yellow opaque hybrid visor similar to Kacchan with ridges that reminded him of Eraserhead's goggles. It wore gloves, the shape jutting out slightly and bulking up the otherwise sleek silhouette. Only the fingers were black, a different color from the rest of the glove that continued up the wrist and halfway up the forearms. A set of small black dragon wings protrude from its back exactly like the dragon hero, Yukio. It wore black shoulder gauntlets that were the same shape as Endeavor's. At the waist was a utility belt with a blank golden buckle like Best Jeanists at the center. Attached was a white cape that came down to the calves. Its legs were still like All Might's bodysuit but with the addition of knee pads like Fatgum and sandals like Edgeshot. He tried to memorize it the best he could, his hand itching to sketch it out already. Did the design mean anything? His brain supplied that it resembled his former attempts at a really young age to craft the perfect superhero by Frankensteining all the best into one messy overpowered amalgamation. While he cringed at his old drawings, he still found this figure intriguing. Could the fact that it looked like a hybrid of his obsession be a part of whatever quirk brought it to life? It continued to stand motionless. Was it waiting for orders? From him or the quirk user? Or did it act on conditions? Did it have a will of its own? He definitely felt something towards it. The only constant factor between both instances where this figure was brought out was where he was present and, in danger. Perceived danger. Would he be able to bring it out when he wasn't in danger? Was the condition that Izuku felt threatened and that made the figure come out? Considering this figure has appeared twice in 24 hours, there's a chance that he was affected by some sort of stray protection quirk. Having a time limit on it seemed reasonable. Maybe he bumped into someone on the streets and they accidentally activated it. There was no way they did it on purpose. With a quirk like that they couldn't activate it maliciously. Ah, he was muttering. But there was no way he could continue his run now. He'll make up for it later, but for now, he changed his route to run straight home. From now on he'll take a backpack running and keep his notebook on him at all times. Izuku bolted through the apartment door and sang out a passing "Good morning" to his mum as he barreled into his room. He ignored the way things got scattered on his desk as his arm swung out for his notebook and a pencil. The figure had disappeared when he took off running, but he had its image stuck in his mind and quickly got to work sketching it out. He managed to flesh it out and include some theories and ideas before the last minute when he had to leave for school. He hugged his mum goodbye and, thanks to his growing stamina and desperation not to be late, managed to run the entire way to school. The day passed with thoughts clouding his mind, thinking about what he knew and what he could learn, planning how to test this strange situation. Going through the day in such a daze, he was immensely grateful that for all intents and purposes, he was invisible. Izuku was mostly invisible before, not standing out in any special way due to his quirklessness. Teachers and most students ignored him. But a few still saw that weakness and honed in. That was before. Now with these uncertain new circumstances, even his bullies turning a blind eye. He was used to Kacchan's intense eyes being on him, and despite everything and all reason, it felt like he'd lost a friend. Izuku was alone in the classroom as the afternoon light filtered in, lighting up the room as he grits a pencil between his teeth and studied the morning's notes and pieced together possibilities. Could he be possessed? It was coming from his person, and it was personalized, as if whatever quirk had caused it had swept every recess of his mind for cobwebs and gathered them together into the ghost of his childish invention. What kind of quirk could do this? A quirk that summoned a self-defense fighting ghost for protection. Hallucinations come to life. Energy manifested of one's greatest desires. All his thoughts were hastily scribbled out on the paper and branched out as he considered each idea. All of them seemed equally plausible. While he was very intrigued by the theory of it, there was a little itch that wondered if he could summon it. He had felt something when it had come forward the last few times, and maybe he was getting his hopes up when he thought it would just be really cool if he could summon it at will. He had tried to reason with himself throughout the day to not get his hopes up, but against all reason, curiosity and longing he dismissed it. Even if for a little while, he wanted to know what it was like to have some semblance of a quirk. Giving his hand a rest, Izuku nervously bit his lip as he tried to channel what he felt when it came out the first 2 times. He strained his mind really hard and was surprised when its image flashed in front of him, trying to come into existence. He expected a little more resistance, but seeing it was almost right there in front of him deepened his determination to make it appear. With a final tug of his mind, the figure was solidly in front of him, just as clear as before. His cheeks strained from breaking into a wide and childish smile when the figure didn't disappear after a moment. Was this like having a quirk? Oh no, he could feel the tears coming. He sniffled as his eyes grew blurry and his crybaby tendencies reared their ugly head. The ghost stood there motionless as he stifled his tears with his sleeve until his eyes were too dry. He'd been eager to thoroughly investigate, and now it was just him and the ghostly figure in the empty classroom. It didn't react to him cautiously stepping out of his chair and towards it. "Hello, my name is Midoriya Izuku, what's yours?" He was a little disheartened by his lack of response, but he wouldn't give up. "What are you? Are you a quirk? Why are you following me?" He jotted down that it doesn't respond to verbal communication. "Guess you can't speak then, huh?" He wasn't too surprised, it didn't seem to have a mouth anyways. It was likely just a shell following around whoever it was possessing. If it couldn't give him any hints, that just meant he'd research and reason like he always did. He reached forward and poked it with his pen. Unlike a ghost, he didn't go through it. His touch met resistance but the figure didn't react. Instead, Izuku shivered when he felt the same touch on himself. His brain quickly reminded him he had felt the touch when the figure stopped fingers from crashing into him. So he could rule out that touch was transferred to whoever touched the figure. Instead, whatever the figure touched was transferred to him. He'd have to experiment some more. He twisted around and wrote in his notebook. It physically exists, and can be touched. Although it did not react, but was that because it was Izuku? Would it react to someone else? Touch is transferred to his own body, likely because it is possessing him. If touching it transferred the touch to his own body, did that extend to pain and damage? Izuku, his mind often faster than reason, quickly crafted a way to find out and punched it in the stomach. While it was interesting that it didn't flinch, it was more interesting that he doubled over like someone had stuck him. That went straight in the notebook. Touch is proportionally transferred to whoever is possessed. It wasn't like his punches were very strong yet, but the recoil was exactly what he'd expect if he punched himself in the stomach. His guts twinged slightly and Izuku made a mental note to choose his experiments carefully. Or at least he'd know what to expect when he attacked the figure again. So if this ghost was like a second body, could it be damaged by something other than Izuku? He clicked his pen and tried to dig it into its forearm, but the surface was unlike flesh, so he didn't feel it. He'd have to figure out what can damage it and what it can feel later after he thinks of a more concise way to measure. The entire time it just stood there, not moving in the slightest. Izuku felt bad for it and felt the compulsive need to apologize, but if it wasn't really alive, did it feel anything? Now he felt mean for just assuming it was a thing. He apologized anyways. "I'm sorry, I hope this doesn't hurt you." No response. "I'm sorry for punching you earlier. I didn't really think that one through, huh?" Izuku's guts had pretty much recovered, but he'd hate to think how it would have felt after some more training. The ghost didn't reply, but it still felt like he was being listened to. Like someone didn't mind his rambling. If it was a part of him for the time being and had no apparent will, did it follow his will? Could he make it move? Scrunching his face up in determination, he narrowed his eyes and willed very hard for the figure to move. In his mind, he pictured it moving over to the table beside him and picking it up. To his absolute shock and eagerness, it did just that. It picked up the table like it was weightless and held it in the air like it was waiting for more instructions. Izuku chewed on his lip as he scribbled more pointers in the notebook. It was like moving his body, but a second body. It was strange. This thing must be tied to him as it enacted his will and not its own. Should he get a notebook just for the ghost? He'd think about that later. Right now he had to work out what else this thing can do. He made it put the table down, do star jumps, spin in circles and do push-ups until he had moving it completely under control. Then he made it grab the pen and write notes down. The handwriting was an exact match of his and Izuku could barely contain his awe. This would make for an awesome quirk. Initially, he thought it was like a ghost and could only interact with the world if it had a purpose. But maybe if he willed it to be ghost-like, then it couldn't be touched. It was worth a try and would always rule it out if it didn't work. He made it move towards the table and it didn't collide. Izuku was clicking his pen frantically as he thought, so he could turn its ability to touch things on and off with his mind. That would mean he wouldn't have to worry about being damaged through something happening to the ghost. Izuku had already filled out 5 pages about this ghost. It really deserved its own notebook, but he'd already written so much. He supposed it'd just have to be included in his hero analysis series. This would be a pretty cool power for a hero. If only he could keep the ghost. He'd definitely be able to be a hero with a power like that. Back to Schrodinger's ghost before he goes off on a tangent about how this quirk would be great for heroics. It can and cannot interact with things. "I'm going to try to punch you again," Izuku explained. Should he be asking permission? Hopefully it won't hit you. He felt a bit awkward, so he formed a fist again, this time imagining his fist phasing through. And it did. His arm flung out and met no resistance. He pulled his arm back and then pressed forward with the intent to touch, this time his hand splayed out against its abdomen. So he could change if it was a ghost or not. Did that apply to the entirety of the body at once, or could parts be toggled on or off? He noted it down for later. He made it move further away, but it wouldn't go further than about 3 meters no matter how hard he strained. He moved it in a couple of different directions, but it never got further, concluding it was tethered to him. How long until it goes away? He hated how this was only temporary. He didn't want it to go, but that just made him more determined to document as much as he could. Being reminded of the time, he checked his phone and tried not to drop it when he realized he had to get ready. He had training today with All Might and he didn't want to be late. He practiced making it go away and come back as he jogged out of the school. It didn't take long until he had pretty much got it down. Somehow, it was already like second nature. Most of the things he figured out with the ghost felt suspiciously like second nature. Maybe the intuition came with being affected by the quirk. Turning out to the crowded street, he didn't want to send it away, so he left it out as he walked home. He made sure that it wasn't solid so it wouldn't bump into anyone, and it made him feel less lonely as it flanked his side. It also served as a test to see if anyone reacted to it. He'd be able to gather information from their response. But no one seemed to notice. Izuku's eyes were flittering at all the passing faces, but not one turned his way or raised an eyebrow or showed any sort of curiosity or alarm at the large amalgamation floating around him. It could be because most people minded their own business, and in a world of flashy quirks it wasn't that interesting. But Izuku had made it move suddenly and violently and no one reacted. Usually, sharp movements drew the attention of eyes by instinct, but no one saw it. So maybe he was possessed by his own personal ghost. He noted it down as he waited at a red light. This quirk was becoming more complex at the minute, much to Izuku's delight. Maybe he could ask All Might about it. Surely as a pro, All Might had seen so many crazy quirks in action. He'd know what's going on or be able to advise him about it. His mum was already home by the time he burst into the apartment. He cheerfully greeted her and he tried not to feel disappointed when she couldn't see the ghost. Izuku made it move swiftly from side to side and her eyes never left him. He wasn't surprised there wasn't an exception to the rule so far, but he still wished his mum could see it so he could show it off to her. But maybe it was for the best. Even if it was really cool, it wasn't his to keep. He could still feel her arms roped tightly around him as she apologized when he asked if he could still be a hero. He kept the ghost by his side as he changed into his workout gear and left the apartment. He jogged to the beach with a bag over his shoulder and notebook in hand. This'll be your first time meeting All Might, right? He had only just officially met the ghost that morning and he hadn't met with All Might since, so he already knew the answer. But Izuku still narrated it for the ghost's sake, just in case it didn't know about the number 1 hero and Izuku's hero training. It felt nice to be able to talk about whatever he wanted with someone. This was probably what having a friend felt like. He felt a pang knowing that it was only temporary. He pushed the disappointment aside and turned his rambling back to the ghost. If it can hold things, he could give it a measuring tape and move it until he found the radius of his range limit. If it can lift things, does it have a weight limit? Maybe he should go to a gym with weighted equipment. If it can move, how fast? And how accurately? It could write, which required some level of dexterity but wasn't the same as agility. What was its durability? What Izuku really wanted to know, from the moment he discovered it could move, was could he make it fight like a hero? Surely if he could move it he could make it throw a punch. He dismisses all thoughts when he sees a lone lanky man standing by the beach. At just the sight of him, Izuku was buzzing with excitement and energy, like a child given an energy drink. It takes everything he has not to fanboy and run up to him while shouting his name. Spending a lot of time with him has helped him get over the habit, but it still feels so unreal that he gets to train with All Might. He can't help that each time more questions spring to mind, and even though he tells himself to simmer down and be careful with the fragile new arrangement, he ends up word vomiting all over the man. But All Might is a great hero and takes it in stride. Each time Izuku is so relieved that he didn't just ruin their mentorship by being creepy. So hopefully that meant that this time would be like all the others and All Might would be able to give him some pointers. Young Midoriya, even in his deflated form his voice still seemed to boom, unintentionally hyping Izuku up. Are you ready to train hard and hone your body to become a vessel for greatness? Yes, of course. He bounced up and tossed his gear by the railing separating the concrete and sand. I just have a few questions if that's all right. Okay, let's hear them. All Might didn't seem fazed at all, having quickly caught onto Izuku's compulsively curious nature. Right, so first of all, how is One for All transferred? All Might hadn't made it exactly clear how, but he did say that Izuku wasn't ready for it. But maybe he started the transfer early. By accident. It was almost impossible considering everything he knew about the Ghost Quirk and All Mights, but Izuku wanted to rule it out. That is a well-kept secret that you'll learn when the time comes. That would be a no. Izuku already knew it couldn't be One for All. Well, might as well be honest with his angle and hope he can get some kind of insight. Right, so have you ever encountered a quirk that gave you control of a ghost that no one else could see? Can't say I have, my boy. Why do you ask? Well, I know it's really specific but I keep seeing this thing. It looks like an action figure but bigger and I can move it and touch it but no one else can see it and I don't know why it's appeared, or how or why now, and I know it can't be my quirk because I don't have one, but I can't find who it would belong to or when it could have happened, and I don't know how long it'll stay around. So you're being haunted. All Might's eyebrows were furrowed. Is it causing you harm or distress? Well, the opposite actually. It's helped me out a couple of times. Izuku stuttered and played with the drawstrings on his shirt. Well then, it's not a problem. All Might declared in his booming voice that meant everything will be all right. I see you've thought this well out. You can tell me later if your ghost problem continues, but for now, let's get your mind off of that and do some training. Well, if All Might had encountered anything similar he would have mentioned it. If as a pro hero he didn't think Izuku was in any danger, then he wasn't going to question his judgment. But Izuku still hoped All Might would have something to say about it. Trying not to feel a little disappointed, he rolled his shoulders and sent the ghost away. He felt a little guilty putting it away like a toy, but he didn't want to get distracted. He followed All Might down to the beach filled with determination. He'd investigate and experiment later. For now, he wanted to train as hard as he could to become a hero. Getting home late with an exhausted body didn't stop his eager mind. Izuku had bid goodnight to his mum hours ago and was now sitting at his desk with his ghost beside him. His hand had cramped badly from writing pages upon pages, so he'd given the pen to his ghost. It turned out that it didn't fatigue from repetitive movements like a person would, which really Izuku should have picked up on when he made it do push-ups to get used to moving it. His obsessive note-taking was really going to reach the next level, at least for however long this quirk lasted. Izuku had written a lot of pages, half about what he figured out and the other half were thoughts about what he figured out and other things he could test. He'd gotten a tape measure on his way home and after handing it to the ghost he found out the range was 3 meters exactly, which restricted long-range potential in a fight. He found some marbles buried in a drawer and flicked them at the ghost with a makeshift slingshot to test its precision. The ghost was able to catch them with ease, but that was probably because Izuku was shooting them and knew their whereabouts. Even when he closed his eyes the ghost still caught the marble. He'd have to get someone else to shoot them, so he didn't know where they were coming from or how fast. He'd done so many tests and there were still so many he could do. With each new thing he found out he grew more ecstatic. When he watched heroes fight he could only work with what he saw and rely on reasoning if his theories and conclusions were plausible or not. But the ghost was attached to him and available. If he wanted to find something out there was nothing to stop him. A full-body yawn caught him off guard. It was long past his bedtime and he knew he'd feel the effects of staying up so late in the morning as he struggled to keep his eyes open. The time was blurry when he checked, but even through his exhausted haze he still felt a jolt at seeing it was now the early hours of the morning. He slipped his notebook shut and he decided against tidying up his notes, knowing he'd come back to it first thing in the morning. Well, later in the morning. He didn't mean to stay up that late, but he'd just gotten so carried away. This situation was just so exciting and he couldn't help but obsess over it and find out every little thing he can. which made it all the harder to go to bed. Despite how tired he was, he didn't want to stop. But he had to. He couldn't let anything hold him back from his efforts to catch up to the Quirk and become a hero. Izuku bonelessly sagged into his bed and sent the ghost to turn the light off. His eyes felt less strained as he shut them and willed himself to go to sleep so he could get as much rest as possible. "Good night," he whispered as he reluctantly put the ghost away. Even now that he was alone in his room, he could still feel it there, nestled deep in his psyche like a blanket around his soul. He liked to imagine this was what it was like to have a Quirk. Izuku's new routine was hellish and unforgiving, but it wasn't long until he got into the rhythm of it. Every night he went to bed with aching muscles from progress, spurring him on further. He'd do whatever it takes to catch up and cover the distance. The first thing he did upon waking up at 4 in the morning was check if the ghost was still there. Every day he'd prepare himself, thinking today will be the day he wouldn't be able to feel the ghost anymore, that he lost his borrowed power. But every day the ghost would shimmer into existence without hesitation. Maybe once certain conditions were met the ghost went away, but Izuku could rule that out easily enough. As each day passed it became more and more likely that the ghost was here to stay, despite how impossible it seemed. Izuku was hesitant to get used to it because once he did, that would be when it went away. Izuku would breathe a sigh of relief before continuing with his grueling routine with the ghost in tow. It accompanies him on his run to meet All Might. He keeps it out as he drags scrap off the beach. Sometimes he's tempted to have it help him with the larger, more awkward pieces, but that would be cheating and wouldn't help him get stronger. Wait, if he shared a nervous system and could feel touch through it, then surely muscles were shared as well. Could he exercise the ghost? Should he be exercising it? "What are you thinking about, my boy?" His mentor popped up beside him and nearly gave him a heart attack. For someone so large he sure moved quickly and quietly. "All Might, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to get distracted." Izuku flushed when he realized he had been rambling again. "It's quite all right," All Might reassured. "Perhaps it's time to take a break." Izuku agreed and sat on the beach steps as he ate a protein bar while All Might stared out to the sea next to him. "Is your ghost problem gone?" he asked conversationally. "No, it's still here." Izuku stopped himself from going into depth on his reasoning. "I was just thinking about it. It's not really a problem. I don't mind it being here. I just don't know when it'll go away and there's still so much to learn about it." "What's there to learn?" All Might leaned forward as he gave him his full attention. "Maybe if you run it by me, I could help you figure it out." Izuku gulped down the last of his protein bar. Was All Might offering him a hand in his research? He beamed as he scrambled to find his notebook. "Well, I still need to find out how much it can lift." His eyes scanned the pages as he hastily flipped through them. "But I'd need to know the weight of the things it lifts so I'd have a measurement and a figure to work with. Maybe I should get a gym membership. The weights in there are labeled and I could work up them, and I should get a gym membership anyways if I'm going to be a hero. I'd say this weighs about 250 kilograms. All Might's strong voice cut him out of his mumbling as the man effortlessly held up a fridge longways with one bulky arm. Izuku was sure he was frothing. He didn't even see All Might move. Yeah, that'll work for now." He dashed over and examined the fridge. Its condition could change the results of the experiment. But it was still in relatively good condition if you ignore the slight rusting. It was impressive that All Might could give an weight estimate from only picking it up. He didn't doubt that it was wrong either. All Might's enhanced strength made him proficient in lifting many heavy things on the job and probably had a good reference and feel for the weight. He should just pick it up now instead of taking mental notes. Izuku moved the ghost closer and slid both its hands under the fridge an equal distance from All Might's palm. He made sure it had the fridge's center of gravity in the correct position before taking it from All Might. The man started spluttering blood and jerked back into deflated form as he watched the fridge with wide eyes. Izuku was watching as well, sorely regretting putting his notebook down as the ghost held the fridge. The ghost didn't seem to be struggling with the weight, but if the fridge was any bigger it would be sitting awkwardly in its arms. Izuku noted his muscles didn't hurt. He could feel the contact, the pressure of the fridge, but no strain indicated he was lifting it. So it seemed they weren't connected by muscle. So if he trained hard and worked out, it wouldn't affect the ghost, and presumably vice versa. Was the ghost able to lift the fridge because it was strong enough to lift the weight, or was it capable because the surface area wasn't too big for it to hold? Would that mean it could lift anything of a reasonable size regardless of weight? Or was it both, something it could hold and not too heavy? But what was too heavy? Should he be comparing the ghost to a human? How much can a human lift? All Might cleared his throat, snapping Izuku's attention to the dazed man. Well, I believe most pro heroes can lift 100 kilograms. That would be without a quirk suited to strength and in an emergency, not regularly, right? Izuku clarified. Yes, I believe so. All Might looked a bit perplexed as he considered his next words, then shocked as the ghost put the fridge down. I promise it doesn't distract me from my training. Izuku rushed to reassure his mentor that he was completely dedicated to his strict hero plan before All Might cut him off. Sorry my boy, I don't doubt your dedication. I was just caught off guard from seeing that ghost in action. Sorry, it was a bit misleading to call it a ghost. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. I don't know what it is really, but well, I could explain it, but I don't want to be annoying, and I just promised it won't get in the way of my training, and I could just show you my notes. He felt a bit vulnerable showing off his notes. Only his mum had been privy to them, and it wasn't often he showed them to her anymore. Sure, All Might sent him a smile that reassured him. I'll take a look while you get back to training, young Midoriya. Izuku gave a nervous smile as he opened the page where he had started on the ghost and told him which way to flick through before getting back to work. He kept tensely glancing at his mentor, who leaned against the railing while flicking through the notebook with an unreadable expression. When the time came for him to leave, he dusted his hands off on his clothes before approaching All Might. The man handed back his notebook with a wide grin. Midoriya, you should use this power as a quirk. Any advantage is helpful when it comes to heroics. Also, I must say, these notes are really insightful. You haven't had the ghost for long and yet you deconstructed it so well. I doubt you'll have any trouble with the academic aspect of UA. Izuku blushed at the praise and stuttered out his thanks. All Might made it sound like he was really smart when anyone could do that. But using the ghost as a quirk. It wasn't his quirk and he didn't get to keep it. If only he could, then he could use it as a hero. But he would still find out what he could while he still had it. Can you help me with another test? Of course, but you'd better make it quick or you'll be late for school. Of course, so could you please punch it? The ghost, softly. All Might gave him a reasonable look of hesitancy at his request. Are you sure it'll help my boy? Yes, I need to find out if other people can hurt it well, me. When I punched it the impact was transferred to my body, but I don't know if that applies to other people. I know that all touch is transferred, so my theory is that damage is transferred too. My boy, are you saying this will hurt you? All Might spluttered some blood and caught it with his sleeve. Oh, you don't have to punch it hard. I just need someone else to test my theory. Please, it'll really help. All Might sighed as he shifted into skinny form. Izuku moved the ghost and instructed All Might where to punch. The shoulder of his non-dominant arm should do. If he went for the abdomen again and it hurt too much, he might not be able to walk home. He braced himself as All Might wound up. It didn't hurt. It's okay. You don't have to hold back so much. He protested. All Might shook his head as his fist bumped against the ghost. That's right, All Might couldn't see it. It was probably very strange for him. No, young Midoriya, there was force behind it. If anything, I was worried it was too hard. But it had hurt when Izuku punched it. Did that mean other people couldn't harm it? Only whoever it was possessing. But what about objects in its environment? Surely something sharp could hurt it. But it can also go ghost-like. So anything sharp would just go through it. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how suited it would be up against villains. He really hoped it was here to stay. It would be perfect for hero work. Yes, it really would. All Might agreed. You should be training this ghost. I'll devise a new and improved American Dream plan to include your new power. I'll help you with your tests and you'll master it in no time. Izuku wanted to remind him that he didn't know how long he'll get to keep the ghost, but the excitement bubbling inside him pushed his hesitancy down. After thanking and parting with All Might, he briskly walked back home with his notebook in hand, furiously writing everything he discovered today. After 5 months, he carefully decided that the ghost must be here to stay. That brings up the complications of how could this be a quirk. It seemed he just had to accept that he didn't understand it and he was blessed with a quirk, no matter how his inquisitive nature tickled his brain. The excitement never hit him in full force. Not when he already had his ghost every day for 5 months. It was already just like another part of him and too easy to accept. However, the confirmation made each day a little bit easier. Each day was just a great day. He was training with all might to be a hero and for all intents and purposes, he had a quirk. The ghost never left his side and doubled as his friend. He also used it to do chores, multitasking, making his life a whole lot easier so he could focus on his goal. He also used it to make his mom's life easier too, without her knowledge. Just whatever he could do. Things she couldn't reach and things he could multitask while doing homework or watching hero news. She'd always thank him and ruffle his hair. Now that he knew his ghost was here to stay, he could finally introduce it to his mom, something he wished he could have done the moment it appeared. He waited until he was home one afternoon with no training for the day. It was a rest day and he surely needed it. Whenever his muscles were too sore to move, his ghost came in handy. He waited until they were eating dinner together before he said anything. So Mom, I've got something important to tell you. Whoops, he made it sound so serious. His mother looked at him with concerned eyes and gave him her full attention. Oh Izuku, honey, what is it? It's not serious. He waved his hands around to try and diffuse the tension. Just that something kinda strange happened a while back and hasn't gone away, and it's not a big deal, it's just kinda cool and I wanted to tell you about it, but I waited so long 'cause I thought it'd go away and then it didn't. He caught himself. His mum never minded his excited mumbling, but he needed to be concise, straight to the point with all the facts without going on a tangent. Well, I'm being haunted by a ghost that I can control. It's a part of me and well, at first I thought it was a quirk because it can't be my quirk. But I don't know what it is and I don't know why it appeared, but one day it did and it hasn't gone away. Inko blinked as she took that all in. It sounded like a quirk, but it couldn't be her baby's. Part of her didn't want him to get his hopes up and get crushed when he's inevitably let down again. But if he waited so long because he feared the same, he must be sure of it. He was smart enough after all. Izuku thought his mum took the news very well. As well as she could when she was as overprotective as she was. It was when he used the ghost to pick up his chopsticks to demonstrate that his mum shrieked in alarm and lost her food down her shirt. Maybe freaking out was a secondary effect. All Might was startled too. So was Izuku the first time he actually saw it. Maybe he should give people a heads up before he used his ghost. He apologized thoroughly as he sent the ghost to grab a towel. I'm sorry. I don't know why that surprised me. His mum gingerly accepted the towel. It's not that I didn't believe you, it's just, well. She trailed off, but Izuku got it. I forgot others can't see it, sorry. If you'd like to see what it looks like, drew a picture of it in my notebook. He didn't know why he phrased that as a question when he knew his mum would want to see it. He sent the ghost to grab the notes from his bag on the couch and didn't miss the way his mum's eyes tracked the notebook as it hovered over. I can become solid so you'd be able to touch it, he informed as he flicked to the right page and handed it over with the ghost. You can if you want, it's right next to you. Inko grabbed the book with one hand and carefully felt for the ghost with the other. Her light and unsure touches tickled Izuku's own forearm. He tried to ignore it as he finished his dinner and his mum looked over his notes. Izuku, honey, that's amazing. Was she talking about his drawing, the notes, or the ghost? She kept flicking through the notes as she ate and he wondered if she could even make any sense of his messy scrawl. I don't know how this happened, but I'm so happy you've got a quirk now. Maybe you're just a late bloomer. Izuku gave her a shaky smile at that as he kept eating. It was almost impossible for him to develop a quirk now, but he wouldn't say that. Now when he evidently had. Was this going to mess up the plan to get one for all? It would be highly suspicious to develop 2 quirks so late in life. He resolved to bring it up with All Might later and figure it out. Does he have a name? Oh, should the ghost have a name? Of course it should. Quirks were given names and he couldn't even name the figure that was with him at every waking hour. It's official, he was terrible. No, he could tell his mother picked up on how guilty he sounded when she sent him a comforting look and slid his notebook back. That's okay, I'm sure you'll think of a good one for him. Yeah, his mum was right. If the ghost was sticking around for the foreseeable future, he'd have plenty of time to think of the perfect name. He helped his mum with the cleaning up, this time not hiding the use of his ghost while he brainstormed some ideas. Whatever he picked, it would be something heroic. Something perfect. He briefly thought about calling it Deku, but he was Deku and he didn't want to call it something so mean. Especially when his ghost wasn't useless. He didn't get many opportunities to research name ideas. Nearly every waking hour was dedicated to crawling towards his dream of becoming a hero. With so much distance to cover to catch up to his peers, he didn't get much free time. But whenever he got a spare moment or found he couldn't sleep at night, he'd work on a list. A list of names are just general ideas that might suit his ghostly friend. He imagined if he had friends he'd ask them for ideas, but All Might and his mum had some suggestions so he jotted them down. In the end, the list was too long and Izuku concisely shortlisted it while he sat in school. Yokai, Amalgamation, Casper, Poltergeist, Invisible, Sixth Sense, Spirit, Ghostbuster, Fighting Phantom, Hamlet, Banquo, Macbeth. After much consideration, Izuku was finally happy with its hero's name. Its cool hero tagline would be the Invisible Hero, the Fighting Phantom. It couldn't be more appropriate and could be shortened to Phantom, on the field. His ghost could punch through solid metal, tried and tested with All Might at the beach. Izuku suspected that the rusted metal probably made a difference. He didn't want to sell the ghost short, but he could see it had potential. Potential he could test once he was at a proper Quirk training facility, hopefully in Ua. His ghost could also do a lot of punches consecutively without tiring, unlike a human, and was promising with martial arts. But he wasn't just looking for a hero name. When he started looking, he had an idea: why not give his ghost a personal name? His ghost had been with him for months and became a friend to him, after all. The name was a lot harder to find. Izuku dug through a lot of folklore and mythology for inspiration, and when he found it, it fit just as perfectly as he hoped. Baku, as the legend goes, is a spirit that looks like a combination of different creatures crafted together by all the spare parts of other spirits. It can be summoned to eat the bad dreams of those who call upon it and fiercely guards its territory and everything in it. It's also considered to bring luck, health, and good fortune. Izuku didn't even need to write the name on the list, the meaning alone had him sold from the moment he saw it. It was perfect, even if it faintly reminded him of Kacchan and left him with a bittersweet feeling. While Baku wasn't able to express emotion, Izuku had a feeling he was pleased to finally have a name. It wasn't long until the entrance exam, and Izuku was training both himself and Baku vigorously with the remaining time. He spent his rest days in front of a computer screen, watching martial arts and boxing videos to test them out himself while having Baku copy. Baku was way neater with his movements than Izuku, likely because Izuku had to watch the moments, process them, then repeat them himself. But for Baku, there was no middleman or physical awkwardness, and he could just do the movement however Izuku pictured, consecutively without growing tired. He was perfect for heroics. The exam was rapidly approaching and Izuku's nerves would not settle, becoming more jittery when he wasn't training and making progress. The only time he couldn't really train was in class until he realized he could still practice movements with Baku. As he was invisible, he could work through fighting moves without disturbing anyone while still preparing for the exam. All Might had warmed up to Baku after his initial shock and insisted on helping train Baku. He started boxing with the ghost, which was awkward the first few tries as Baku was invisible. But it wasn't long until they fell into a routine. All Might would hold his hands up and instruct Baku how to strike. He also tested the ghost's reflexes by having it punch and catch various items until it was reflex for Izuku to see something move and react with Baku. Inko had gotten used to the ghostly addition too. Despite not being able to see him, she never forgot he was there. She ruffled her son's hair when he finally settled on a name and listened eagerly as Izuku explained the legend and his reasoning. He could tell she was still apprehensive about him developing a quirk, but she never brought it up. He knew she'd always worry for him, but with Baku, he'd be strong. Getting into UA would prove it. The school was notorious for its exceptionally low acceptance rates, so only the best and strongest could get in. With Baku and One for All, Izuku was feeling butterflies at the notion that he stood a chance. Though hopefully, those butterflies wouldn't make him throw up. Not when he just consumed All Might's hair and was currently processing his quirk. Izuku tried to keep his mumbling to a minimum in the crowded bus as they approached the examination grounds, and he thought about the exam. He didn't want to distract the other students, maybe his future classmates. Like he did in the auditorium. Focus. He knew what he needed to do. He couldn't rely entirely on One for All, considering he'd be developing it for the first time. No, he'd have to lean mostly on his own skill and Baku. He couldn't risk not being able to use One for All Might's quirk for the first time and failing the exam because he relied solely on it. He didn't stand much of a chance against the robots, but Baku was strong. The only problem was the exam was monitored and he'd need to make it look like it was him that was strong. All Might had recommended that Baku be kept secret. Since Izuku was registered quirkless, developing One for All could be passed off as him being a late bloomer. As One for All was a strength-enhancing quirk, he could pass off Baku as One for All and have Baku as a secret advantage. The seat next to Izuku was taken so Baku was in the walkway, intangible of course, but still a reassuring presence. No matter how the future changed, he'd have Baku by his side. Everything from the past 10 months had led him to this moment. Now was the time to give everything he had and become the hero he always dreamed of becoming. The bus had stopped outside sky-high gates and Izuku spotted the nice girl from before between the waiting crowds. She caught him just before Baku could when he tripped earlier, and he was too flustered and awkward to say anything. But he really should thank her. He weaved through the crowd towards her when a hand gripped his shoulder and he jolted in surprise. Baku was about to react on instinct when Izuku saw it was the boy from the orientation auditorium, the one he distracted with his muttering. He'll really need to work on that habit if he gets into UA. The boy gave him a disapproving look and Izuku shrunk under his gaze. That girl is trying to focus. Are you taking the exam to interfere with everyone else? And no. Izuku waved his hands about as if the motion would clear up the misunderstanding. He could feel himself burning up under everyone's attention. That makes twice, this boy insisted. Izuku wasn't taking this seriously. Whispers and judgmental eyes glanced his way and Izuku was under the impression they didn't see him as a threat. Okay. Start. Head swiveled as Present Mike's voice boomed on the loudspeaker. What are you waiting for? Go. There's no countdown in real life. Run. Confusion and alarm swept the students as most stumbled at the abrupt start. Izuku sprinted into the arena, trying to catch up with the crowd. He didn't want to be already behind from the start. Then a one-point robot appeared and Izuku felt himself lock up. It was bigger than All Might. He didn't get to think about it for long before a sparkling beam shot through the air and hit the robot. We'd make a great team. But I don't think we'll meet again. Adieu. What did he mean they wouldn't meet again? Izuku brushed the thought aside as he ran onward towards a plaza where most of the crowd was fighting. Robots appeared and eager students leapt ahead and took care of them. Izuku had to rip his eyes away and ignore all the cool quirks being openly used. These could be his future classmates. He'd have time to ask about them later if he passed the exam. Right now he needed points and he couldn't see any robots left. He swallowed thickly as he forced himself to move. With a couple of shaky steps, he broke into a run. He promised himself not to be frozen in fear anymore, didn't he? Ever since getting Baku, he'd felt more confident. If he had to be scared, he should turn it into fuel. He ran through the streets with his eyes peeled. He pivoted towards fast metallic movement in the corner of his eye and bolted towards the one-point robot. He ran under it, dodging its attack and overlapped Baku's arm with his. He curled his fist and punched the joint, stabilizing the robot's leg just like how All Might would. Detroit smash. He cried out as the metal gave way and the robot tumbled backwards. Thrill overtook him as he realized he just took down a robot. Well, Deku did, but still. With the rush running through him, he took off to find more robots. The past 10 months of intense training were really paying off as he ran around, avoiding robots and debris from the surrounding chaos. 6 minutes left. Present Mike's voice echoed down the street, urging participants on. He took out a couple of robots this way, always making sure they stayed down. He didn't want to chance that points were docked if the robot got back up and could still fight afterwards. 4 points. His eyes scanned the arena in a desperate search for his next target. The timer was always present in the back of his mind as he ran. While he was ecstatic that he had taken some down, with so many people getting to the robots before he was worried it wasn't going to be enough. Every time he saw a free robot he zoned in and took it down. 7 points. It was easy to take them down, not so much finding them. Suddenly the ground shook and dust gathered in a massive column as an explosion went off. At first, it didn't bother him. He assumed it could be a result of one of the plethora of quirks before realizing that no, that was unlikely. Why would a student use a quirk like that now? They'd use it at the start when they were eager. The ground shook again and buildings creaked under the strain of an absolutely giant robot towering over the street. This was the 0-pointer. Examinees were running by him as he gawked at it. This time he couldn't shake his frozen body into action. His mouth hung open as he watched it move towards him. Isn't it too big? When it smashed its fist into the ground, a current of thick dust brushed past him and through the gawking crowd. Deku reflexively jumped in front, but Izuku couldn't make himself move as everyone else ran past. He needed to move. He needed to run and get some more points in. Less than 2 minutes left. A cry caught his attention. His head whipped around and he noticed a small body pinned under the rubble beneath the robot. It was the nice girl with the gravity quirk. She was awake and moving, but she couldn't get free. Izuku was running before he even realized. Each shake of the ground rumbled through his body and urged him to hurry. Deku was by his side ready for action. Are you all right? There had to be a reason she wasn't using her quirk. I've overdid it. She sounded worried as she desperately tried to make it float. Izuku overlapped Baku's arms with his to make it appear he was lifting the slab to give the girl a chance to wriggle out. She looked sickly as she stumbled onto her feet. Izuku dropped the concrete and turned to see the robot was almost on top of them. The girl may be free, but she was slow, and even with Izuku's help she wasn't going to get out of the way in time. His body started crackling as something swelled inside of him. He knew what he had to do, and before he could even think had shot into the air like a bullet. His eyes swelled with tears from the wind as he sped towards the robot. He pulled his arm back and grit his teeth as he curled his hand into a fist and threw the hardest punch he could. His real punch, without Deku. Smash! He watched in awe as the metal contorted and was blown away by the force of his punch. So this was one for all. All Might's power. It was epic. That was how he was able to jump that high. Then his stomach lurched as gravity caught up and he began to fall. At first, he wasn't worried. Landing should be a piece of cake. But feeling caught up to him a moment later and he realized there were some drawbacks. His arm and legs were mangled. He couldn't use one for all to make a safe landing. So this was what All Might meant when he said he was a vessel made in a hurry. He brought out Deku, who was falling beside him, and grimaced when he couldn't think of what to do. He'd have to use one for all to land. So he braced himself and prepared to smash with his good arm. Luckily it never came to that when something hit his cheek and his body became weightless at the last second. It was jarring as his body stopped, then lurched back into motion as he crashed on the ground. His groan was drowned out by the sound of retching, and Izuku saw the girl hunched over by a piece of robot next to him. That made twice she saved him. He really owed her a big thank you. But the exam was still on and he needed points. 7 points was hardly enough. Not when he heard others counting by the 30s and 40s. Since the girl looked physically fine, Izuku supposed she'd be alright. Izuku needed points, so he'd have to use the ghost to his advantage. Anything to get points. He called Deku close and Baku's limbs were mangled exactly like his. It seemed that injuries transferred both ways. Damn it, he was counting on Baku's mobility. But Baku could still hover and still hand one good arm. It wasn't over yet. Time's up. His heart squeezed with despair. He was too late. Tears swelled in his eyes as his head spun and the world went dark. Each day after the exam passed slowly. Izuku couldn't stop replaying the exam in his mind. 7 points. When Get got them he was proud he'd managed to get points at all, but now he couldn't stop thinking about how it wasn't enough to pass and it was eating him alive. His mum kept trying to reassure him, but there wasn't anything she could say that could ease his nerves. You haven't got the letter yet, Izuku. You don't know that you didn't pass. He knew she was right, but he couldn't stop. He knew it was worrying his mum every time he zoned out and had a staring contest with his dinner, but he couldn't stop. From self-scoring, he knew he barely passed the written exam. But that could be cancelled out with his uncertain score in the practical. He hadn't been able to contact All Might since. Izuku knew that as the #1 hero, he'd be really busy, but he still selfishly wished he could talk to him about the exam, apologize that he might not get in and all his training was for nothing. That his idol saw potential in him and he didn't live up to it. He really hoped All Might wouldn't regret choosing him as a successor. He'd also like to talk about One for All. He hadn't used it since the test, but he could feel something there, a power he didn't have before just waiting to be used. He took some notes about it in his notebook. After all, this was the hero analysis. With All Might's power, he would become a hero. Or he would, if he got into UA. Izuku was sure Baku, fortunately restored after Izuku was healed, was sick of his worried rambling and theories. But his ghost just stood there vehemently and listened like he always did. The letter couldn't come soon enough. He dashed to his room and Baku locked the door as he stared at it for a bit before he couldn't take it anymore and ripped it open. A disc fell out and All Might's bright face and loud voice almost had him falling out of his seat. He gripped his knees under the table as All Might explained that he worked at UA and couldn't contact Izuku. Baku hovered over him when Izuku dug his nails in anticipation as All Might moved on to the results. Even if you passed the written exam, you didn't get enough points on the practical exam. Of course, that means you didn't pass. Izuku's throat swelled shut. He knew it. He already knew it. That is, if that was all there was to it. A recording of the nice girl trying to negotiate points for him played and Izuku was moved by the kindness. The entrance exam was not graded only on villain points. All Might informed. Izuku's heart leapt as he latched onto the hope that it wasn't over yet. How can a hero course reject people who save others and do the right thing? This is a job that requires risking one's life. There's another basic ability the judges at UA look for: rescue points. Midoriya Izuku, 60 rescue and 7 villain points. The recording showed his score of 67 points, making him 5th place by a single point. Come, young Midoriya, this is your hero academia. Izuku burst into tears of relief before the recording stopped. When he had the strength to wander out of his room and break the news, his mother did too. Izuku was still buzzing with feverish excitement from the letter when All Might contacted him with a cryptic message telling him to meet at the beach. It didn't take Izuku long to run straight there without even stopping to breathe. Thank goodness for his training. With Baku's assistance, he lunged over the railing and onto the soft sand, fighting to run up to the skinny figure as he sunk. He beamed when All Might congratulated him on getting in and gave him and Baku a high five as he explained he wasn't on the panel of judges so he couldn't influence if Izuku got in or not. Izuku's insecurity about his exam performance faded as he flushed proudly at the thought of getting in all by himself. With congratulations out of the way, All Might became serious as he confided his reason for becoming a teacher to begin with. He needed a successor. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you I was a teacher sooner, All Might smiled. I had to wait until UA announced it. So you were originally going to pick one of the students. Izuku felt honored at the revelation. There were a lot of good students with good quirks he could have picked from but instead chose Izuku. That was something to live up to. Don't think anything of it. Now I can monitor your progress at school. He had a lot of progress to make. Izuku hoped mastering All for One would come as naturally as Baku. Since All Might was here, now was the perfect time to talk about what happened. He explained what happened in the exam and his lack of control, but was shocked when All Might was really understanding. Did he know that would happen? All Might said there wasn't any time to explain when he gave him the hair. Seriously, they had 10 months. All Might could have at least mentioned it before the morning of the exam. In the future, he'll make sure All Might doesn't leave out anything else important. If nothing surprised him, then he could plan for it. But he'd worry about that later. He needed to learn how to control One for All so he could start training with it. I'm not sure about training. Right now you can only use it at 0 or 100%. You'll need to work on adjustment and control. Since you've already used it at 100%, you know what it feels like. Now you just have to work on not using so much energy. You're still a new vessel and it will take a while for your body to build up to using more power. Izuku thought about it while he flexed his hand and sent Baku to fish out his notebook from his backpack. Over the months he had mastered giving something his full attention while Baku took the notes. It was a real shame he wouldn't be able to use it in class. He'd have to take care to keep his apparent telekinetic abilities a secret to keep the surprise advantage. Even at the cost of multitasking class notes and hero theories. While he was excited to have One for All, he wondered if he could further combine Baku to make his multiple powers appear as one. He'd worry about that later once he was even able to use One for All. All Might blinked at the seemingly floating notepad but was well adapted to Izuku's chronic note-taking habit and moved on, instead noting Izuku's egg in the microwave analogy as boring but reassured him he was on the right track. It didn't seem like a big step, but Izuku was glad to finally have something to focus on. He just needed to take that first step towards mastering All Might's quirk. Baku put the notebook away when Izuku couldn't wring out any more One for All knowledge from All Might, who promised to move on to the next step once Izuku mastered the egg in the microwave. Izuku tried not to feel too disappointed, if anything that made him want to get started sooner so he could see what came next. He could only dream that one day, he'd be able to use both quirks like second nature in tandem with each other. Izuku ran through the school, his head swiveling as he took in as much as possible while getting to class as soon as possible. It was an enthralling experience, finally walking into UA and taking the first steps towards his lifelong dream. He spotted his classroom, idly noting the size of the door. It was huge, likely for accessibility. No thoughts now, he needed to go inside. He clutched his bag tighter as he hoped that he wasn't in the same class as Kacchan or the boy from the auditorium. They were intimidating and he wanted to get along with his classmates. He opened the door to immediately see both loudly arguing with each other. He lingered at the door, reluctant to step into the madness as they got louder and more aggressive. Suddenly Kacchan's irate eyes were burning into Izuku's as he TSKS, causing the tall boy, Iida, to notice him too. He tries not to show he's intimidated by his sharp stare, but can't stop himself from subconsciously putting Baku between them. He needed to be polite. Even if he couldn't convince him that what happened at the exam was a misunderstanding, he could still be cordial. "Good morning," he said weakly and jerked back when Iida was flying towards him. He breathed a sigh of relief when Iida only introduced himself. He felt awkward as Iida went into a spiel about how he misjudged Izuku and admitted Izuku was better than him. Well, that wasn't what he expected. He couldn't get the words out to explain he didn't realize anything, but at least there was no conflict between them. "Hey you, plain-looking boy." Izuku jerked at the voice and turned to see the nice girl. She introduced herself as Ochako and he couldn't get a word out as she said she was glad he passed, then started ranting about his cool performance in the exam. He was embarrassed by her enthusiasm and frankly unrealistic portrayal of his performance in the exam as she made him sound really impressive. "Thanks for saving me, by the way." She smiled brightly. "Now we've saved each other and that makes us friends. This is the hero course, you didn't come here to make friends." A deep grouchy voice interrupted them and they jerked to find the source. There was a shaggy man in a sleeping bag on the floor behind them. How didn't they notice? "It took you too long to notice, and be quiet. Time is limited, you kids are not rational enough." The man grumbled as he climbed out and made his way to the teacher's desk while Izuku combed through his lifetime of hero fan knowledge to try and figure out which pro hero the teacher was. He didn't get his answer when Aizawa-sensei introduced himself as their homeroom teacher and ordered them to gather outside for a quirk assessment, ignoring the shocked students as he walked past them. When the class was gathered outside, Aizawa explained that it was irrational to test them without the use of their quirks and he wanted to see what they could really do. Kacchan's demonstration was really impressive and aggressive and really got the class fired up. His previous best was 67 meters, but when he threw the ball with his quirk it read 705.2. Izuku was full of anticipation. He couldn't wait to see what he could do now he had quirks. I want to know where each of your limits lie. What you can and can't do. What you can improve on. It's a rational foundation for building a hero. The students broke into a frenzied chatter and Aizawa's face darkens when he overhears their excitement. No. That attitude is irrational for a hero. This won't be fun. Whoever comes last will be deemed to have no potential and will be expelled. Izuku was rooted to the spot while the rest of his classmates gasped. Getting expelled on the first day was a serious threat. What was he going to do? He could only use one for all at either 0 or 100 and he couldn't control it. He really wished he could use one for all just a little so he could start training. But he'd have to wait a little longer. If he used one for all just once his body would be broken and he'd fail the tests. Unless he saved it for last so he didn't sabotage himself on the other tests. He'd been obsessively picturing the egg in the microwave since his talk with All Might and he was ready to try and put it to use. But until he could, he'd have to use his ghost, as long as he was discreet about it. With 2 quirks, there was no way he'd be coming last. No matter what, he'll give it his all and be at this school tomorrow. He'd have to be creative with how he used Baku, as long as the tests were compatible. After the first few tests, Izuku tried not to feel frustrated. He hadn't had a chance to use Baku yet. He was able to perform all right because of his intensive physical training, but he was up against people using their quirks and he paled in comparison. Then they were halfway through the tests and Izuku was getting desperate. He was starting to feel the pressure of being unable to compete and he knew Aizawa was watching him, waiting for him to slip up somehow. He breathed a sigh of relief when Aizawa announced the next test, the ball throw. He could use Baku for this one. His relief was cut short when Aizawa singled him out and handed him a ball. He had to prove himself now. It would be safer to use Baku, but the whole class was watching him and couldn't let them catch on. So he'd have to use one for all. Even if it destroyed his arm, it would at least prove he had potential. He gathered all his courage and wound up, but felt frustration prick his eyes when the ball barely soared and fell at 46 meters. What happened? He was just trying to use it. I erased your quirk. Aizawa cut through his thoughts, and Izuku turned to see his teacher's eyes shining red and staring right at him. It isn't rational that a kid like you was accepted. His words hurt, but Izuku was focused on the yellow goggles no longer obscured by the floating hair and fabric. You're Eraserhead, Izuku exclaimed, finally having put 2 and 2 together. You can't control your quirk. Do you intend to be a liability? The capture weapon darted towards Izuku, who flinched back at the fast movement. Muscle memory kicked in as Baku bolted forward and instinctively knocked it away. Aizawa blinked for a split second in surprise, but his hair never dropped completely and his eyes regained their sinister shine as they locked back onto Izuku. It's not my intention at all, Izuku reassures. Aizawa must have heard what happened in the exam. Of course he did, he was a teacher. He probably saw it and now he doesn't think Izuku has what it takes. You can't become a hero with a power like that. Aizawa cut in, but his demeanor seemed different from a moment ago. I've returned your quirk. Now throw the ball. Izuku was sweating but filled with determination. The same determination blazing inside of him, growing hotter as he grew and urging him to prove everyone wrong. I still can't control my power. Should I give my all with this one throw? He grit his teeth as he thought it over. This is my only choice. I have to go all out. Otherwise, it's just like Aizawa-sensei said and at this rate, I'll never be a hero. He fired up one for all, channeling all energy into just one finger. Minimizing injury and maximizing power, he threw the ball. He fought down tears of happiness as he watched it grow smaller as it soared and crashed into the ground, further than any quirkless boy could dream. His finger ached and he knew if he looked it would be swollen and bruised, but he ignored it and pulled his hand into a fist. He didn't want Aizawa to think he was a liability in any way. "I can still move," he exclaimed and smiled at Aizawa, whose face was carefully neutral as he showed him the screen. 705.3 meters. An unfathomably high number for his short-circuiting brain. He could hear the class cheering him on. Ochako and Iida were the loudest. But a moment later everyone goes silent when Kacchan is advancing angrily and accusing him of lying about a quirk. Izuku doesn't know what to do or say, frozen in place while Baku is posed between them. This is the first time Kacchan had looked at him in ages and now he was mad. Kacchan angrily broke eye contact when Aizawa wrapped him up and glared at him. The tests continued after that and Izuku was glad for the distraction from his turbulent guilty thoughts and sore finger. He supposed it was more motivation to make progress with One for All. He didn't get another chance to use One for All but luckily, and also to his annoyance, the rest of the tests were perfectly suited for Baku. Of course it would look like he was incompetent until Aizawa put him in front of the class. Hopefully, his improved performance redeemed him in his teacher's eyes. Especially since he came first in the strength grip test and push-ups. It felt like cheating when he could seemingly do unlimited push-ups without tiring, but this test was to test their quirks, not them. But he still felt like the class's cheers were undeserved as they cheered him on. It was strange but only served to motivate him to work harder to one day undoubtedly deserve the praise. He knew he'd done exceptionally well when all the tests were over. After all the tests were geared towards those with physical quirks and both his quirks were strength-enhancing, one way or another. Still, that didn't make him any less nervous as their teacher stared at them with unwavering judgment. He still hoped he impressed his critical teacher. When Aizawa presented the results, he breathed a sigh of relief and pride swelled. He'd gotten into the top 5. He couldn't wait to tell All Might. Sure, it wasn't really because of One for All, but he'd still be happy. By the way, I only said I'd expel last place as a logical ruse so you'd give your best performances. Aizawa grinned and the class erupted in disbelief. Izuku's disbelief was interrupted by his finger aching. In hindsight, he should have just used Baku because now he'd have to hide this injury until he could get to Recovery Girl. But it seemed dishonest to pretend he was better at One for All by cheating. Now get changed, your curriculum sheets are in the classroom. Before Izuku could turn away, Aizawa's quirk-enhanced glare was directed deep into his soul. "I'll walk you to the nurse's office." Izuku could only nod as he held back his trembling. How did Aizawa know he was injured? He thought he hid it well. He followed his teacher into the main building and through the tall halls. Hiding injuries is a liability and withholding information from your teammates is illogical. "I'll expel you if this happens again." Aizawa narrowed his eyes. Understood. Izuku's hair bounced with the force of his nod as shame flushed through him. Aizawa was silent for a moment. "Since you know who I am, I suspect you know how my quirk works." "Well, yes, you can erase any quirk you look at." "Well, not any quirk, only emitters and transformation types but still." Aizawa had an edge to his voice as he kept his suspicious eyes on Izuku. "So what happened when I used it on you? As far as I'm aware, your strength-enhanced quirk is categorized as an emitter." Izuku shrunk under his glare. "Right, Baku. He was meant to keep his ghost a secret and he already blew it." "Wait. Baku wasn't erased." He didn't realize that. Aizawa erased One for All, but not Baku. His brain started going into overdrive to figure out what that meant. Eraserhead can erase multiple quirks at once, so it isn't a matter of one at a time. There are 3 types of quirks: emitter, mutant, and transformation. Baku was definitely not a mutant, which was the only quirk Aizawa couldn't erase. So why wasn't Baku erased? Is Baku not a quirk? That's one possible explanation, but there had to be others, right? He racked his brain for another but he kept circling back to the obvious inference was that Baku wasn't a quirk. Baku was some kind of power, but not a quirk. Which should be impossible. "Kid, I can't understand you." Dang it, that was out loud, wasn't it? If he impressed Aizawa earlier then no doubt the man thought he was stupid now. But it doesn't matter how he feels, he needs an excuse. What happened earlier? He could tell from his tone that he sounded guilty, and internally cringed when he realized that made him more suspicious. Aizawa leveled him with a glare. When I activated my quirk, you still somehow dodged my capture weapon. Right, well, I don't know why that happened, Izuku admitted. He wasn't good at lying on the spot, so saying anything convoluted would only sabotage him later. Hopefully, that was an acceptable answer. Being a pro hero, his teacher probably knew how to tell if people were lying. Aizawa squinted at him and Izuku could feel nervous sweat gathering at his hairline. Luckily they reached Recovery Girl's office. Izuku tensed as Aizawa paused for a moment. Was he really going to make him answer here and now? Izuku didn't have any lies prepared, outright or by omission, so he would eventually break if his scary teacher kept staring at him. Come back to class right after. Aizawa's gruff voice broke the staring contest and he walked away. Izuku let out a breath of relief and knocked on the door. Aizawa could tell the boy was hiding something. He didn't have the time or patience to push for it right now, but he was sure it was a matter of time before he found out. He turned down the hall to see All Might loitering, doing a terrible job pretending he wasn't waiting for him. It seems he won't be getting back to his classroom right away either. It seemed that only Izuku's acceptance letter featured the number 1 hero because the class exploded in shock when All Might burst into the room. I am here, as your teacher, the man boasted as he gave his signature grin. He hardly seemed surprised at the volume and cleared his throat. The whispers died down immediately and stayed down as All Might explained today's class. The moment he unveiled their hero costumes and dismissed them, the commotion picked right back up, and number 1 hero or no, nothing could silence their excitement. Izuku included. Izuku overheard students chatter as they eagerly grabbed their costumes and walked to get changed. Everyone couldn't wait to try on their outfits and have All Might as a teacher. The chit-chat didn't stop as they got changed. Izuku tuned it out to check out his costume. It incorporated the bodysuit piece his mum gave him and his love for All Might. Only now, he thought the green rabbit ears on his head resembled Baku more than All Might. He supposed that was what his mum was aiming for when she stitched it, fitting since he and Baku were a package deal now. His ghost had been floating beside him all day, reminding him of the mystery of his new power. He doubted he'd get a chance to talk to All Might anytime soon, but that wouldn't stop him from theorizing. Everything he knew about quirks changed when he learned about One for All and challenged what he believed was possible. He really wanted to ask All Might about it. Surely the best hero in Japan would know something about powers that aren't quirks. The class was restless when they gathered at Ground B and All Might explained today's assignment, mock battles. Izuku tried not to feel anxious as he drew his number. He didn't know who he'd be paired with or who he'd be up against. He didn't worry long when Ochako bounced up beside him. Hey, we're a team, isn't that great? She grinned. I like how simple your costume is. Mine's a little too tight, but that won't stop me from doing my best. Izuku blinked owlishly as he was overwhelmed with Ochako's foreign friendliness. It had been so long since it was directed towards him by his peers and he wanted more of it. But he wouldn't be getting more of it for now, not when they were up against Iida and Kacchan. He could feel Kacchan's eyes burning into him from the second the lots were drawn. We can do it. Ochako gave him an optimistic smile as they walked out onto the grounds. He felt at ease from Ochako's positivity. She was right, between the two of them, they could do it. Izuku started planning as they waited outside the building for the trial to start. He knew that being against Kacchan meant there was a target on his back. He and Ochako should split up. He'll draw Kacchan's wrath and keep him busy while Ochako looked for the bomb. Ochako enthusiastically agreed and gave him a thumbs up before they went into the building and split up. Now it was a matter of how he'd fight. He couldn't use One for All reliably without putting himself out of commission, but he'd have to try if he had an opening so he could train using the quirk. But it wasn't the most practical idea as it was an inside battle and at risk of hurting Ochako or Iida if he couldn't control it. So that meant he'd have to rely on Baku, but to keep Baku a secret he'd have to be careful as the trial was being observed. Izuku crept through the hallways with Baku in front of him, fists up and ready. It was only a matter of time. Kacchan wasn't exactly discreet. Izuku could hear him shouting for Deku, to show himself and fight while Izuku was fighting against his hammering heart telling him to be afraid. But how could he be a hero if he couldn't fight? Izuku sucked in a deep breath as he turned the corner to face Kacchan. Deku. Kacchan growled as he ran towards him, right fist raised. Since when did you have a quirk? Why would you lie about it? Was tricking me a joke? Izuku did feel guilty at how upset Kacchan was getting, but now wasn't the time to dwell on it. Kacchan's face twisted in anger and surprise as Izuku blocked his attack. Kacchan, I took notes on you too. You always start with a right punch. Izuku advised as he disguised Baku's strength as his own and twisted the other boy over him by his arm. He threw Kacchan away, who was too stunned to attack but stopped himself from hitting the ground with an explosion. Izuku jumped back and kept Baku by his side as he waited for the opportunity. He had his head in the game and here he was going to let Kacchan know his resolve. I'm not the Deku you knew and I won't be giving up. Kacchan just growled and started firing blasts at him. When he couldn't land one on Izuku's front, he propelled himself in the air and arched over his target. Izuku moved too slow and Kacchan sent off a blast behind the back of his head. The flash burnt into his retinas as the sound churned his stomach. A piece of green fabric floated to the floor. He scrambled forward as Kacchan kept attacking. Izuku dodged as he thought about what Baku could do. It was only thanks to years of notes on Kacchan's fighting style and All Might's training that Izuku was able to dodge at all. He didn't know if Baku was immune from the explosions and now wasn't the best opportunity to find out. Maybe between the flash and cloudy smoke, he could make his move without tipping anyone off to his ghostly advantage. Until then he was stuck on the defensive. Luckily the martial arts he taught himself allowed him to keep up with surprising ease. The motions that he practiced with Baku were now second nature for him. Kacchan wasn't holding back as he tried to throw some more punches. He managed to dig his fingers into Izuku's bicep, spin him around and blast him against the wall, knocking the breath from his lungs and making Baku shimmer in and out of existence as his head hit the wall. Why won't you use your quirk, Deku? Do you think you're better than me? Kacchan roared as an explosion singed the wall where Izuku just was. He didn't know how to reply as Kacchan kept attacking, never blasting enough to create a big visible obstruction. Izuku knew Kacchan was smart because the smoke would stop him from finding his opponent, who from his perspective has a wildcard powerful quirk. These gauntlets aren't just for show. This whole time they've been building up with explosive sweat. Kacchan smirked as he pointed it in Izuku's direction and held the pin. Izuku quickly pieced together what was happening a moment before All Might's protests blasted through the speakers. If he got his timing right, this was his opportunity. He moved Baku as far forward as he could and stretched a ghostly arm back, ready to grab him at a moment's notice. Stop it, you'll kill him. Then he better dodge. Kacchan grinned sharply as he let go. Just as he did, Baku pulled Izuku forward and under the range, sliding behind his opponent as his ears rang and threatened to explode like his rival's palm. The light and smoke meant Kacchan hadn't noticed him or seen where he went. He was too stunned to stand, but as he was lying directly beneath Kacchan, Baku fished the capture tape out of Izuku's pocket for him and wrapped it around Kacchan before he could notice. Kacchan was captured. As the smoke cleared, Izuku could see he was walking away and looking for him, completely oblivious to his whereabouts. Izuku continued to lie on the ground. His heart was in his mouth and his ears were ringing. It was only just dawning on him how dangerous his idea was as his stomach grew queasy. Just how dangerous Kacchan's move was. Izuku had been right in front of him. If he didn't move. Obviously, Kacchan expected him to move. He never held back, and when you're in a fight you assume your opponent wouldn't either. Izuku could start to make out sounds, but it was like they were underwater. Some of them were coming from his headpiece. Ochako no doubt felt that explosion from wherever she was. She was talking, but all her words of concern strung together into one sound that he couldn't process. The explosion had torn the walls of the corridor down, opening the level of the building and coating the floor in a thick layer of dust that stuck to the back of his throat. Kacchan was stomping around while scouring the rubble, and Izuku could make out what he was saying. Deku, where are you? Come out and fight me. The speaker crackled again as All Might spoke up, sounding strangely proud and stressed. Bakugo, you've been eliminated. Midoriya, can you please give some indication you're all right? Izuku pushed himself up when he heard the unsavory angry shouts as Kacchan finally noticed the tape. I'm all right. He was only a little dizzy. Light hurt his eyes and his mouth was really dry, but All Might didn't need to know that. Kacchan looked positively murderous as he turned Izuku. What did you do? You're supposed to fight. Why do you always act like you're better than me when you were a quirkless loser? Do you think you're too good to use your quirk on me? Izuku shook his head and regretted it when it shook his brain as well. He was going to admit that he wasn't very good at using one for all yet when All Might urged him to continue the trial. He backed away as Kacchan seethed. I never thought I was better than you, Kaka. Do you think beating me changes anything? I'll still beat you and win. I'm not a loser. I'm going to be the #1 hero. I'll surpass you. So next time you better not sneak around like a coward and I'll beat you when you're using your damn quirk. Izuku felt conflicted as he left Kacchan fuming, but he had a trial to complete. Luckily Ochako contacted him a moment later informing him she had found the bomb but Iida had cleared the room to prevent her from using her quirk. Iida didn't know she was there but did know Kacchan was eliminated because of the speaker announcement. Izuku quickly hashed out a plan for a much more serious Ochako. He hastily scooped up some debris from where Kacchan had knocked down walls and gave it to Ochako as he raced up the levels and passed her on her way down. Izuku quietly approached the door to the room Iida was in and waited for his teammate to get into position. When he had confirmation he ran into the room. There was no using Baku here, so he'd have to rely on Ochako. If things went badly, then he'd have to use one for all. Which would put him out of commission, but also guarantee their victory if used right. I found you, he exclaimed and pretended to press his earpiece. Ochako, I found the bomb. Izuku tried not to smile as Iida stepped in front of the bomb and made an over-the-top impression of being a villain while he could see Ochako float up through the window behind him. She was holding the sharp piece of concrete that Izuku had given her to strike the windows, waiting for his signal. He knew he'd have to improvise, but luckily Iida gave him an open. It wouldn't seem suspicious to Iida if he played along with his over-the-top roles. I'll stop you, he pointed as he screamed, loud enough to cover for what comes next, villain. Ochako took that as the opportunity to strike. She activated the window with her quirk and struck it with the debris. It shattered but held in place, suspended like droplets of water floating in the air. She drifted harmlessly through it as it slowly sailed away from her. Izuku kept his eyes on Iida and kept his face determined. He couldn't be nervous now. Iida was oblivious and was laughing evilly, completely oblivious. You can't win against me. But we did. Ochako beamed as she held the now weightless bomb. Pride flushed through him at their victory as she cheered. It was a shame he couldn't use one for all, but he'd have opportunities in the future to train with All Might and hone it. Besides, he got to use Baku. Whatever power Baku was, Izuku was glad to have his ghostly power and he intended to make the most of it. Izuku was still jittery from the trial as he stepped into Recovery Girl's office. The thrill of winning was still vibrating in his bones. The elderly hero wasn't too impressed to see him twice in the same day and gave him an earful about his light burn injuries and All Might's questionable teaching technique of pitting children against each other. He respectfully apologized and promised to take care in the future, but her harsh words hardly put a dent in his spirits. When he came back to class he was overwhelmed by everyone looking at him and praising him for his performance. Izuku clammed up as his classmates patted him on the shoulder and expressed their admiration for his cunning performance. Even Iida commented on his thoughtful technique, relieving Izuku that no grudges were made. All Might gave him a thumbs up from where he was standing. He couldn't do more than stutter out thanks and join Ochako as she waved him over with a blinding smile. Izuku kept his gaze straight ahead as he briskly walked over. He could feel Kacchan's anger radiating off him in waves as the other boy ground his teeth in fury. Izuku tried to not let it get to him as he watched his classmates battle. He quickly became obsessed as he watched their quirks in action, making him wish he had his notebook. Izuku would just have to settle on mental notes. The minute class was dismissed for the day, Kacchan stormed off. Izuku didn't know what compelled him to run after Kacchan. He didn't know what compelled him to reassure the hothead that he wasn't deceiving him and he obtained power, but the second the words were out he wanted to slap his hands over his mouth. He'd said too much. Luckily Kacchan didn't take him seriously. He was just his usual fierce self, declaring he'd become number one no matter what and surpass everyone, even All Might. The number one hero seemed taken aback by the blunt declaration but still tried to wrangle the walking wrath that was Kacchan. It wasn't long before he was determinedly storming off. Izuku watched him go, feeling guilty about deceiving Kacchan and hinting at All Might's secret when the man wasn't here and said to never tell a soul. But since Kacchan didn't believe him, he probably didn't need to mention it to All Might. But now he was finally alone with his mentor and could finally ask him what had been bugging him all day. All Might, have you ever encountered a power that wasn't a quirk? All Might thought about it for a second before shaking his head. Sorry my boy, I can't say I have. What's this about? Izuku tried not to feel too disappointed. All Might had decades of experience but a power that wasn't a quirk was unheard of for even the number one hero. Well, Eraserhead's quirk erases quirks with a few exceptions but those exceptions are irrelevant because well, in theory, if Baku was a quirk, he should have been gone. But he wasn't, and I know that Eraserhead was using his quirk because I couldn't use one for all, and I know I couldn't use it because I was using it and it got cut off but Baku didn't at the same time. So I don't think Baku's a quirk. All Might paused as he thought about it. Well, I'd say that sounds impossible. But I suppose one for all is proof that quirks work in strange ways. Are you sure Baku isn't a unique quirk? Izuku shook his head as he rested his hand on his mouth. No, the only way I think it's possible is if I think outside of the box. My gut is telling me that it has to be something else. Eraserhead's ability is without exceptions, so that wouldn't make Aizawa the exception. So it has to be Baku. I see, All Might said, a hand resting on his chin thoughtfully. I can ask pro heroes and others with experience, but I can't promise anything. Really, thank you All Might, I'll do some research of my own too. Between the two of us, I'm sure we can get to the bottom of this. I know we can, my boy. When Izuku walked through the door he was greeted by his inquisitive mother, who urged him to describe everything. Izuku smiled as he told her about their scary homeroom teacher. The tests and battles slightly changed so she wouldn't worry, making friends and seeing everyone's cool quirks. She let him talk on and Izuku was truly happy to have such a supportive parent. He left out his current dilemma of, what exactly is Baku? He doubted she'd take the chance of circumstance as well. She always worried about him. At the first opportunity, he holed himself up in his room and opened his laptop. He turned the laptop on and started searching while silently berating himself. He should have done this when the ghost first appeared. It was suspicious that he got a power when he did. He Googled, sifted through threads, and scoured the internet for the slightest hint of a trail leading to his answer. This would be so much easier if you could just talk. Izuku sighed as Baku hovered beside him. But he knew that wasn't fair. If Baku was him, his spirit and will, then he'd need to know the answer to be able to give himself the answer. Eventually, after some digging and differently phrased searches, he found something. Stands. After some reading, the description fit his ghost perfectly. A stand is a power that originated far before the dawn of quirks, a visual manifestation of the life energy of one's soul. Stands usually present themselves as a figure hovering beside the user and possess capabilities beyond that of an ordinary human. As an embodiment of someone's psyche, stands are as varied as human minds can be. Stand users can see other stands while non-stand users are oblivious. These stands also have an ability of their own, like their own quirk. Depending on the user, can be wielded for good or evil. They were still around in the age of quirks even if the user had a quirk already. Scrolling through a thread as he became more and more convinced of his breakthrough, Izuku noted most people can't pinpoint how they got the stands if they weren't born with it. Most were born with it but some got one out of the blue, saying they all had a strange injury before they first saw their stand. Hold on, he remembered getting cut by a strange thing he picked up. Was that the cause of his new power? He pulled the innocent-looking arrowhead from his desk and held it carefully, wary of the sharp edges as he examined it. Was whatever it was made of the cause of the power? Or was it the maker who infused it with power? He could conclusively say that in this instance it was the cause of Baku, but could it only give one person a stand? Or unlimited? Were there certain requirements that had to be met to gain a stand from it? If this thing gave people powers that only a select few could see, it would be really bad if this fell into the wrong hands. It was up to him to keep it safe. Since it was innocuous on its own, he figured hiding it in plain sight would probably do the trick. He placed it beside his figurines hoping it would be mistaken for hero merch. Feeling content with his choice of location, he turned back to his research. Baku's hand moved a mile a minute, filling up the notebook's pages with new information as Izuku kept scrolling through every relevant forum he could find. He really should have done this ages ago. There was just so much more to learn about a whole world he didn't know about. His mind stopped on one particular thought. Stands had abilities, like quirks. So what's Baku's ability? It seems like he can rule out moving through physical things as Baku's power since most stands can do that with their ghost-like nature. He turned his research onto other stand users on the internet. By analyzing their abilities and how they discovered them, he might get some ideas on how to uncover Baku's ability. After some more hours of research, he's almost at the end of his journal. It seems most stand abilities are as bizarre as quirks. For the most part, they function like quirks, to say that there is no logical limit to what is possible and anything you could dream of as a power. However, the abilities of humanoid stands were overwhelmingly leaning towards contact-based and activate their powers through touch of the hand or fingertips. While quirks were genetic, stand abilities were not. It is said that the power reflects the desire at the time the user developed the stand. But that didn't give Izuku any lead at all. He remembered the day he found the arrowhead. How could he not? That was an eventful and emotional day. He wouldn't be able to pinpoint what desire the stand factor latched onto. He supposed once he discovered Baku's power it would make sense to him. Right now his best bet was that Baku's ability manifested through his contrasting fingertips. But finding the conditions for activation would be challenging. There were some complicated quirks out there that took years for the user to fully understand. Some quirks were just so weird that he wondered how the user discovered their ability in the first place. Maybe it was quirk intuition, but he doubted it would be so easy for him. How did Eraserhead figure out how to activate his quirk and what it did? The circumstances and coincidences before that might have just been trial and error. But quirks were mostly genetic, so his parents could have guided him. So finding out Baku's stand ability wouldn't be as easy as figuring out one's quirk. But Izuku was determined. He had All Might to help him out. He hadn't felt this excited since he was 4 and waiting for his quirk to reveal itself. One way or another, he would find out what Baku's ability is and use it to become the greatest hero. When Izuku woke up for his daily morning run, he didn't expect to see a text from All Might asking him to meet at the beach. Had All Might found out something after all? Did he know about stands? Izuku was burning with excitement to share everything he discovered last night and hopefully learn more if All Might found out something new. Izuku sprinted to the beach, ignoring the chill in the fresh morning air in favor of thinking about everything he uncovered. He wouldn't be able to rest until he learned everything he possibly could about stands, a power system similar yet completely different to quirks. Had someone formally researched stands yet? Or he would be the first? Or was it top secret for only those with one and he just had to keep digging? He would definitely have to dedicate a notebook series to stands just like he has quirks. Izuku could see a skinny figure staring out to the water on the pristine beach. Having learnt from the last time, he did not call out to his mentor as he jumped over the stairs and stumbled in the sand. "Good morning," he chirped breathlessly and All Might jumped. I'm sorry I didn't mean to shock you." "That's all right my boy, I was just distracted by my thoughts," All Might reassured with a chuckle, "but never mind that. I asked around and I'm sorry to say but I haven't found anything that could help you." All Might seemed nervous, though it may just have been his civilian presence didn't exude confidence 24/7. The man smiled in an unspoken apology but regret made it more of a grimace. But his face slowly morphed into confusion at Izuku's lack of disappointment. Oh, that's all right. I guess not many people would know, not even the top heroes. Thanks anyway, All Might. Izuku smiled brightly. I figured it out. Thought. Baku's definitely not a quirk. There are powers besides quirks and they're called stands. Izuku rambled into a brief, and he really did try to keep it brief, description of what a stand is. Okay. There was no way he could keep it brief, not when there was so much to say. He needed to share everything he learnt with All Might. Then he wouldn't be on his own, and All Might could certainly use the knowledge as the #1 hero. Izuku believed you could never know too much. Also, there's different types of stands and different types of appearances. Many people uploaded sketches of their stands, and Izuku looked at each one with fascination as he quickly noticed a pattern. There are 5 types of stands. Close range, long remote range, automatic, colony, and some that evolved when the user was under stress. Since Baku can't go any further than 3 meters away from me, I suppose that means I have a close range stand. The benefits are impressive physical ability but unable to do anything long range, which is probably for the best because One for All operates best in close range combat, so it would be easier to disguise. Izuku supposed he should think about adapting a long range strategy. If he wanted to be the best possible hero, he would have to cover all of his bases. When it comes to appearances, apparently the design reflects the power and why you have a stand in the first place, but sometimes it just has the characteristics of the user. He would have to analyze each component of Baku. The superhero influence did not go unnoticed, but whether it meant something, Izuku didn't know. There's 2 appearances with 2 subcategories, either looking humanoid or not, and looking natural or artificial. Baku really reminds me of an action figure, so I suppose that would make him artificial humanoid. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, All Might said proudly, that you've figured it out and found out so much already. Yeah, I didn't sleep too well last night, Izuku said sheepishly before bouncing to the next topic. There's still so much I don't know, like what Baku's power is. Power. All Might frowned. Oh, right. Stands have quirks of their own. All Might gave him a shocked look. Their quirks, well, stand abilities, mostly work like quirks with the same logistics, Izuku clarified. But I have no idea what Baku's quirk is. So I could really use your advice, All Might. How did you discover your quirk? All Might's mouth opened before closing just as quick, and he blinked as he processed it all. Then, just as he looked like he was about to reply, a conflicted look crossed his face and made him hesitate. All Might, are you okay? Sorry my boy, there's just a lot to think about, All Might chuckled nervously. Midoriya, as my successor, you will learn many secrets, potentially dangerous secrets. I suppose sooner or later, I would have been entrusting this one to you. Before I met my mentor, I was quirkless. Everything Izuku knew about All Might flashed in his mind. How could All Might not have a quirk? It hadn't been too long since he got One for All, but Izuku hadn't seen All Might use any alternate quirk. In fact, for his entire career he'd only used moves that could be attributed to One for All. Not a single hint of another quirk. I never led you to believe that I was born with a quirk, but I guess you assumed I did. And now that you know. Izuku didn't have a quirk, but he was still able to attain One for All, which explained the origin of All Might's one and only power. It was hard to wrap his head around the fact that his hero and idol was born quirkless, just like him. And now he was quirkless again. But before Izuku could go down the rabbit hole those thoughts provoked, All Might caught his attention with his regretful voice. What I said on top of the building on that day, I must sound like a hypocrite now. But I want you to know I truly believed it. Before I met my mentor, Nana, I only had my dreams for a better future. I wanted to make it happen. For me to have said that, I must have forgotten what it was like to be young and believe I could change the world with my bare hands, with or without a power. Maybe, when I said those things, I was really talking about myself and my own path. Maybe I meant to say that without One for All I could have never been All Might, and never had made it without a quirk. All Might put a hand on Izuku's shoulder, whose mentor was becoming more and more blurry as Izuku teared up. I am truly sorry for dismissing you that day. From now on I hope to make up for it by mentoring you to the best of my ability. And not just because you have won for all, but because I see that you have the same determined drive to change the world with your bare hands. The way I see it, for you to gain a power that isn't a quirk, that is a testimony for your willpower." Instead of a response, Izuku burst into tears. All Might tried to apologize for that too, but Izuku stopped him while insisting he was forgiven and sent Baku to grab tissues from his bag. Once his emotions had settled down, All Might asked Izuku to share everything that he'd learned about stands next time they caught up and promised to assist him with figuring out Baku's quirk. There was so much about stands and Baku he couldn't wait to discover, starting with his current obsession, Baku's ability. Sure, All Might promised he'd help him, but Izuku just couldn't wait. It was the only thing on his mind as he walked to school. From reading about other stands online, it seemed the user just figured it out the more they used their stand. But Izuku had Baku for almost a year and nothing happened that challenged his belief that Baku was just a quirk, so he might need to be more proactive than just waiting for it to appear. So far Izuku's plan was to have Baku touch a variety of objects while urging something to happen. If he could make Baku phase through things just by willing, then hopefully it was just as simple to make his power work. According to other stand users on the internet, it was just that simple and they knew when something was being activated, even saying there was a faint aura around their stand when its ability was activated. His musing was interrupted when he noticed the horde of reporters flocking the gates of UA, blocking the entrance and pestering students. Izuku was anxious at the inevitable ordeal that would be passing them. It didn't make him feel any better when he heard them fixating on All Might. His worry about the situation temporarily gave him a reprieve from his obsession. He was wrong to think that was the last of the unusual events that day. The class was surprised when they had to participate in a refreshingly normal activity like choosing class representative. It took an unusual turn when somehow Izuku got more than 0 votes and became the class representative against his understanding. He felt he didn't deserve it at all. Before UA, he hardly participated in school or class affairs. He was hardly suited to be the class representative. At lunch, his new friends were trying to convince him otherwise when an alarm startled all the students and the cafeteria turned to mass panic. It didn't help when he could hear students saying the school had been broken into. He used Baku to pull himself free from the masses and not get caught in the crowd crush in the hallway. Luckily it was resolved fairly quickly thanks to Iida shooting above the crowd and informing them it was only a false alarm. The students settled down for the rest of lunch, but the subject of choice was talking about the reporters. Izuku ignored it in favor of thinking about who should be the class representative. Iida was perfect for the role. Izuku, not so much. He needed to be 100% focused on becoming a hero after all. And with his recent discovery of stands and subsequent future research, he had enough on his plate. Oh, but Yaoyorozu hesitated when she realized she said that out loud. What's wrong? Izuku put his thoughts aside and tilted his head when he heard his classmate's tone. Oh, it's nothing, I'm sorry. As the class representative I must insist that you voice your thoughts. Iida's instructional voice left no room for debate. Well, I was given more votes so. Yaoyorozu glanced off to the side. Oh, I see. Izuku wrung his hands together with awkward shame. I suppose that isn't really fair. If I step down it would be you taking my place after all. I guess I spoke without thinking, but I still think that either you or Iida would be better at this role than me. Should we hold a re-election with 2 candidates? Iida questioned. No, that's far too much trouble. Yaoyorozu shook her head. If it's something you want, you can't be wishy-washy about it. Kacchan grunted from his seat. If you can't be decisive then you're not suited for class representative anyway. I suppose you're right. A re-election is the perfect solution. No, I see that I've only upset the natural order of things with complete disregard for procedures in times like this. Yaoyorozu should be the class representative and I should be the vice. Well, that still relieved Izuku of the responsibility and he knew that Iida would embrace the role much better than he could. The exchange of responsibility didn't last long when an annoyed Aizawa quickly changed the subject and informed the class of an upcoming excursion, much to their delight. Izuku was looking forward to it too. He needed a chance to practice rescue. But this could also be an opportunity to train with Deku for rescue work and figure out how his stand works. He was bummed he couldn't use One for All for it, but he'd meet up and train with All Might later. He'd just have to push what he could do for now and get better by whatever means possible. The minute Izuku got home and gave a passing greeting to Inko, he threw himself back into more research. At the moment all he could find was personal accounts of others' experiences with their stands. But that would be enough for him to see patterns and analyze potential. So with a new notebook open and a pen in Baku's hand, Izuku picked up from where he left off. When the day of the excursion arrived, Izuku was able to shake off all sleep deprivation as excitement grabbed a hold of him. As he sat on the bus with his classmates, it didn't escape his notice that All Might wasn't there. But seeing as no one else was particularly worried, he assumed he was already there. He got anxious when everyone on the bus teased Kacchan. The boy got huffy but didn't do much beyond yelling back, which spurred on the teasing. Izuku made sure not to look in his direction and give him a reason to get angry, instead focusing on sifting through ideas in his mind about Deku. Ideas ranging from what the ability could be to how to efficiently use Deku in rescue. He became so invested in thinking that he didn't realize the bus had come to a stop and Ochako was tapping him on the shoulder to let him know they'd arrived. If he thought the dome was big on the outside, the inside was so much bigger. 13 passionately explained disaster relief work and told them they have the power to help people while the students eagerly listened. Izuku looked around at all the different zones with analytical eyes and he noted what environments he'd have an advantage or disadvantage in. But overall, he should be competent at rescue work. Once he had mastered One for All, he'd seen All Might do rescue work. His favorite video of All Might was his rescuing people from a blazing fire as he accounted, "I am here." So since he had All Might's quirk, then he'd be just as suited. Deku floated above him as Izuku was surrounded by peers. With Deku, he'd be a great hero. The extra set of hands would be very efficient at rescue work. He could carry twice as many people. 13 had just wrapped up the speech when a distorted, wispy purple shape appeared in the center of the dome. Izuku could hear his classmates take an interest in it as he observed it. It seems they were jumping straight into it, just like everything else so far. UA was really amazing. But then the mood shifted when Aizawa tensed. Izuku held his breath as 13 faltered and Aizawa confirmed that this was not a simulation or test. They were under attack. It almost seemed impossible. This was UA. But Aizawa readied his capture weapon and ordered the class to stay right where they were with 13. The purple mist swirled and exploded and the class watched with increasing levels of unease as intimidating figures emerged with antagonistic looks. Villains. Aizawa sprinted towards the villains and immediately started taking them down. Usually, Izuku was eager to see villains because that meant seeing heroes. But in this instance, he felt nothing besides a strange urgency to do something. Izuku sent Deku to the front of the pack while keeping an eye on the number of enemies that had converged on their teacher. Even from so far away, they could hear everything. Probably because of the dome, but that wasn't something Izuku was thinking about when he heard one of the villains question why All Might wasn't here. Izuku's jaw tensed as he thought about why the villains were expecting All Might to be here. It was public knowledge that he worked at UA, but why would they assume that All Might would be here, with this class, at this time? Was it connected to the break-in? Izuku snapped out of his thoughts when the lead villain covered in hands spoke up. "I bet All Might would show up if we kill the kids." He said it in a bland voice as he scratched his neck as if the children watching from the sideline were nothing more than bugs. The class certainly heard that comment as the severity of the situation sunk in. Aizawa's head snapped around. 13. Get the students out of here. Izuku didn't see 13 react. His eyes were fixed on Aizawa and watching with both awe and worry as their teacher took down the villains without a sweat despite being outnumbered. As amazing as it seemed, Izuku knew that Aizawa was only one misstep away from being taken down. He knew enough about the man's quirk to know that he couldn't keep the villains at bay forever. But a new threat arose. The mist villain lurched towards them and darted to cut them off. Izuku quickly changed targets and had Deku follow the movement and attempt to punch the purple smoke emitting around where the villain's voice appeared. Baku's fist phased right through the mist and Izuku noted that the villain didn't have a physical body, or at least the mist wasn't a part of it. He only noticed the pair of amused yellow eyes staring down the students once the villain had moved from Baku's range. Things happened very quickly. The villain introduced the group as the League of Villains just before Kacchan and Kirishima tried to attack. Before they could even reach their target, the mist exploded forward and for a brief second Izuku was surrounded by darkness. Suddenly Izuku was engulfed in water and his breath was cut off. He tried not to panic as his eyes adjusted in time to see a menacing shape approaching him. He jerked into action and tried to break the surface of the water as the villain gained on him. He wasn't going to make it, the villain was faster. Before the villain could get him, Izuku sent Baku out and punched the villain. Then he desperately swam to the surface, gasping as something wrapped around him and pulled him out. It was Atsu, dumping him on the ship situated in the middle of the makeshift sea right next to Mineta. This isn't good. Mineta trembled as he peered over the balcony to see the ship surrounded by the menacing stare of villains. Izuku sent a calculating glare their way as he wordlessly slotted Baku between them. While they seemed content to stay down there, he just needed that reassurance that they wouldn't be getting up. As long as they stay down there we're safe, Atsu noted. Atsu, all of them have quirks that are advantageous in the water, but so do you. Izuku glanced around at the other areas of the dome. I don't think the villains put any thought into where they put us. Call me Sue, Sue chirped as she considered what Izuku said. Hopefully that means they didn't put much thought into everything else. There was a little back and forth about what they should do, mostly between Izuku and Sue because Mineta was too busy giving into his fear. Izuku felt bad for him, but being in the hero course this was their time to overcome that fear. It doesn't matter if they planned for us or not, we have to get out of here. The only way to get out of this is to fight and win. It was their only choice. Everything was moving so fast, it was hard to keep track of everything demanding his attention and pushing him onwards. If anything, it sharpened his resolve to get out of this without anyone getting hurt and he was confident they could. Their plan was quickly put into action when the villains forced their hand by attempting to sink the ship. Izuku didn't have time to think of an alternative to using one for all, so reasoning it was their best chance at getting out of here, he took the plunge. Even if it did sacrifice Small Finger, he had Baku to make up for it and 9 other fingers to spare. All that mattered was he got his classmates to safety. Luckily the risk paid off and Izuku hardly had time to marvel that his finger was not destroyed before his attention was urged elsewhere. They still weren't in the clear. His heart stopped as he watched their teacher fight the large group of villains. Aizawa initially seemed to be doing fine, but surely and slowly he was slowing down and becoming exhausted. Izuku couldn't take his eyes off him as he watched him power through and keep fighting, despite the obvious threat of what would happen if he stopped. We should do something, Izuku said hastily. If we see an opening we could help him. But then we'd be targets, Hiro, Sue said. If we get in the way we could make things worse. Izuku was busy thinking up ways to respond and strategies to use against the villains, but those trains halted in the station when the ringleader, introducing himself as Tamura Shigaraki, finally faced Aizawa. While he hoped that Aizawa could take him down and end this, he couldn't stop himself from analyzing the man's every move. If only he had his notebook here. He was wondering what this man's quirk could be when Aizawa's quirk was deactivated and in the split second his hair dropped, the villain touched his arm and Izuku watched in morbid horror as Aizawa's arm crumbled away. It wasn't by much, but Izuku could easily imagine the application of such a quirk if this villain really pushed it. Aizawa recoiled and jumped out of range, but he still had to deal with the other villains. Izuku's attention was torn between him, as if his gaze alone kept Aizawa alive and fighting, and the hand villain as if his gaze kept him from reaching out and finishing the job. Shigaraki had an emitter-type quirk, obviously activated through touch if he was only able to do it then once Aizawa's quirk was deactivated. Sue gasped beside him and Izuku snapped his eyes to see what she was looking at and gasped when he saw a monster join in. Shigaraki introduced the monster, the Nomu, with gleeful elation. Aizawa didn't stand a chance. The Nomu pinned him down and the villain gloated that this creature was made to rival All Might and destroy him. Izuku would like to believe that wasn't possible. It couldn't be. This was All Might they were talking about. But in a moment of weakness, the villain's conviction was enough to make him doubt it. If that thing could rival All Might, then there was no way Aizawa could free himself. Especially when the Nomu crushed him into the ground until he was limp and Izuku felt helpless hiding in the water as the villains held Aizawa's life in their hands. But all he could do was watch as the purple mist villain appeared from nowhere. One of the students got away, he said, causing Shigaraki to scowl and squint. Izuku almost breathed a sigh of relief at their incoming rescue. Almost. I don't want the heat of everyone showing up, Shigaraki growled as he scratched his neck. Izuku hoped this meant they'd wisely leave, but he should have known that was wishful thinking. He froze when the ringleader turned to them, like he'd known they were there the whole time. I don't want this to be all for nothing. I'll knock the symbol of peace's pride down a notch first. Time was distorted as Shigaraki approached. Despite the fact that Izuku knew he was coming this way, it felt like he appeared in front of them with no warning. A pale hand reached out and descended upon Sue's face. Izuku's classmates were frozen in fear. He was filled with fear too, knowing what would happen. He didn't want to let it happen, and somewhere inside him, instinct kicked in. Baku snatched the villain's wrist and slapped his hand onto the ground to redirect the destruction while Izuku pulled Sue back into the water and in her element. Everyone was confused when the villain's hand suddenly slapped the ground. Everyone was more confused when the ground didn't crumble. Past Shigaraki, Aizawa had his hair raised as he used his quirk on the villain. "You're so cool, Eraserhead," Shigaraki said in what could only be described as strange. It wasn't sarcastic at all and sounded like a genuine compliment. Izuku couldn't wrap his head around it, but his main concern was keeping out of range from his villain. Sue was frozen in his arms and he was hesitant to move if it meant bringing Shigaraki's attention back onto them. His entire body flinched and Sue squeaked when Shigaraki motioned and Aizawa was smashed back into the ground. Izuku held his breath, but Aizawa didn't get back up. Shigaraki controlled the Nomu, which could very quickly be turned on them no matter what distance they were, but Shigaraki was right there. This was an opportunity. If he took out the ringleader, he would take out the Nomu. Because he had to be sure he was successful, he would have to rely on Baku instead of All for One. In a quick and fluid motion, he pushed Sue behind him and overlapped Baku's arm with his out of instinct as he lunged. All he had to do was knock the villain unconscious and this was all over. Just as he threw his punch, the Nomu intercepted it and Izuku flinched at its sudden arrival and quickly rethought his plan. All for One was a risk, but this thing was built to withstand All Might at his prime, so clearly not effective. But he had a trick up his sleeve. The Nomu was right in front of him, blocking him from Shigaraki physically, but the villain was still in his range. He couldn't get to the villain, but Baku could. Before Shigaraki could react and make the Nomu do anything, Baku phased through and punched. From behind the large black mass, Izuku heard a crack and thump as the villain was presumably out cold. There was a second of stillness over the battlefield. With no one to give the monster instructions, it just stood there. Izuku's body was in a tense fighting stance as he anticipated something to happen and he needed to protect his classmates. The villains watching suddenly became very unsure without their leader. There was a moment where they looked at each other with obvious uncertainty before the mist villain stepped up and ordered a retreat. The mist stretched out and expanded in front of Izuku's field of vision, swallowing the ringleader and the Nomu, teleporting them away along with every other awake villain in that area. Izuku acted before he could think. He didn't want them to get away, not when their backup was on the way. Just before the Nomu was fully warped away, Baku lunged forward through the mist and dragged it back out only a split second before the portal shut. Success washed through him before leaving him with a cold, regretful feeling. He did not think this through. If the portal closed on Baku, who knows what could have happened. Also, the Nomu was a monster and now he brought it back. He froze to see if it would move, but it was like an empty husk as it stood rigid with a 1,000-yard stare. At least that meant the villains didn't have it and it couldn't hurt All Might. He carefully stepped back and it didn't react. Good, hopefully without being in the hands of the villains it would stay inactive. He turned back to check on Sue when he realized there was still fighting going on in other areas of the dome. It seemed the mist villain left most of their group behind. Maybe it was a desperate move to retreat as soon as possible, or a calculated act to distract the incoming heroes with saving the students, and the retreating villains would be long gone before the heroes realized there was more to the attack. Is that thing alive? Mineta stuttered as he stepped behind Sue. At being touched, Sue's unwavering eye contact with the Nomu broke and was replaced with irritation. She tried to shake Mineta off from where he was nervously clinging to her arm, and Izuku thought maybe he should offer his arm instead, but then he thought of an idea. He knew the Nomu was incapacitated, but it would make everyone else feel better if they knew it too. Mineta's quirk was perfect for keeping the Nomu in place visually to help everyone relax. Hey, you want me to what? Mineta squawked. Oops, was that out loud? It's just to make everyone feel safe. It is safe now, but then we don't have to worry about it, and that way it's already captured when the heroes arrive. But, Mineta was extremely reluctant but inched closer. It's already safe. There's no one here to order it around, Sue stated, then squinted at Izuku. How is it here? What did you do to the villain? Izuku's brain froze as he realized he'd need an explanation for that. His eyes skirted over to the Nomu, then past the Nomu. Aizawa was still there, unmoving, and Izuku's victory of taking out the villain and getting the Nomu was short-lived, because what if Aizawa? He couldn't think like that. I don't know. Izuku fought to sort the threads out in his mind, sort out what he needed to do each step at a time. We need to see if Aizawa is alive, okay. They quickly run over to Aizawa and carefully examine him. He was collapsed in a twisted pile of limbs as blood soaked the ground under him. Feeling too reluctant to move any closer, Izuku sent Baku forward to check if he was breathing, if he had a steady heartbeat, anything. He's alive. Izuku breathed a sigh of relief. He doesn't look too good, hero. The doors burst open as All Might's booming voice rung out through the dome. Have no fear, because I am here. Izuku watched as All Might lunged into action and started cleaning up the remaining villains. He supposed that more backup must be on the way because Iida didn't return with All Might. As All Might defeated the villains with ease, the other students were herded towards the center, and Izuku was relieved to see everyone was unharmed. He didn't need to offer an explanation when his classmates noticed their teacher, gasping, swearing, or staring with unfocused eyes, and were immune to the calling of their own names. Momo. Uraraka shook the other girl, and only then did the spell wear off. I'm sorry. Momo ran her hands down her face as she tried to pull herself in the present. Tisk, you should be. Bakugo scoffed, and others turned to him critically at his harsh tone. You're the class representative, so this is your chance to step up. Do something, damn it. Yeah, right, Momo echoed. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again she had a fierce look of determination. Uraraka, can you please take a roll call of everyone here and take note of what area they were sent to, with whom, and what injuries they received. Just note down anything relevant, I'm sure it'll help. Momo pulled a clipboard, note and pen from her body, passing them to Uraraka before continuing. Who's confident in their ability to give first aid? A few people stepped forward, and Momo gingerly knelt in front of Aizawa as she started to print piles upon piles of medical supplies from her body. Doing this as soon as possible might help, Momo muttered as she handed out wads of bandages and some splints. Every little bit we do now might make a difference later. She handed Izuku some cleaning spray, and he quickly got to work, only stopping when he was finished and Uraraka was asking him for his account. He felt guilty that he couldn't do more for Aizawa, so he had Baku apply pressure on bleeding areas that hadn't been wrapped yet as he turned to his friend. She seemed calm on the surface, but her movements seemed robotic, and she couldn't stop clicking the pen whenever she wasn't writing. What about you, Uraraka? Izuku asked as he took the clipboard from her hands. Are you okay? Well, I'm not hurt. I'm fine, she insisted and took the clipboard back. All right where I was after I do everyone else. When Iida came back, he brought the rest of the pro-hero teachers with him. The staff quickly took over the scene and wasted no time in detaining the pile of unconscious villains that All Might had left behind. With the villains out of the way, the highest priority was Aizawa's urgent medical assistance and checking over the students. All Might was praised for the villains' initial retreat as Smentos restrained the Nomu, only for confusion to arise when he informed them that they had left before even he arrived. The students pitched in to fill in the teachers up until the moment that Shigaraki randomly fell. Everyone was staring at Izuku, Mineta and Sue, the only ones present at that time. Izuku tried not to seem too suspicious as he met All Might's eyes and tried to convey what went down without alerting anyone else. I tried to use my quirk on him when I punched. The Nomu got in the way, but I think my punch just went through him. All Might would know that using one for all on someone without a quirk to survive it would be a bad idea, especially when Izuku could only use it at 100%. So logically, that wasn't the quirk he was talking about. Izuku still had Baku softly punch All Might so he'd get the idea, just in case. Right, well, good job. The police should be here soon so everyone should go outside now and wait. But then the villains were retreating and they tried to take the Nomu with them. I'm not sure what happened but they didn't just leave it behind, Hiro. Izuku cringed as he thought about how he'd play that off while still keeping his secret. Luckily All Might came to the same conclusion and was quick to try and wrap everything up. Not to worry, we'll get everyone's account and piece together what happened. But I must say, you students did a good job handling things here. I'm impressed with how you dealt with an emergency like this. You did great. All Might gave them a big thumbs up and the teachers agreed with the sentiment with how they handled things. Izuku's eye twitched at how obvious that cover-up seemed but reasoned it was only obvious because he knew there was something to hide. But as the students were ushered out of the dome, Sue's eyes were on him and he wondered if she realized there was something to hide. He knew it was possible, she was smart. He kept his eyes forward and tried to walk normally under her scrutinizing gaze. With the event officially considered over with the hero's arrival, the rest of it passed in a blur. Thanks to Momo's list, medical assessments went much quicker as not every student needed assistance. It made it easier for the detectives who pulled them aside for questioning. Izuku realized he should have been using what little time he had to be thinking of a cover story for Baku before it was his turn to be questioned. I'm Detective Tsukauchi, the man introduced himself with a bow. I want you to know that you can speak freely about what happened. All Might filled me in about your situation. My situation, Izuku repeated as he thought about what the detective already knew. Yes, All Might passed his quirk down to you and told you to keep quiet about one of them. Well, that wasn't what Izuku expected. He did see All Might pull the detective aside earlier while he was waiting around but didn't think much of it. He didn't know how many more people knew about One for All, but clearly, All Might knew and trusted this man. It also meant that All Might alluded to Baku, which meant that Izuku didn't have to alter his recount of what happened. Why yeah, Izuku quickly confirmed, then recounted what happened at Tsukauchi's insistence. I just hope that having the Nomu can actually help. He finished and tangled his hands together. He couldn't get rid of the images replaying in his mind, of how fast and how strong the monster was. Aizawa was helpless against it and if it could really rival All Might, then what hero stood a chance? I'm sure it will, you did good grabbing it. Quick thinking will make you a good hero. Tsukauchi sighed. Unfortunately I can't say much on the matter at the moment, but if who we suspect is behind this, then I'm sure you'll be hearing it from All Might. It was like someone had glued his eyelids together. That was the first thing he noticed before the pounding in his head became more prominent. The pressure built until it was almost unbearable and only then could he force an eye open and take in his dim surroundings. Shigaraki noted the bar was dimmer than usual. Quiet too, but the silence was loud and pressed against his head and he could hear every hum of the electrical equipment in the spinning room. He knew the TV was on before he even saw it and the shame and frustration from his failure set in at the same time as violent nausea. All Might didn't show up. He didn't fucking show up. Shigaraki couldn't even stick around until he showed up. His limbs were too heavy to move so he had to will his stomach to settle before he could speak. He opened his mouth and, "Take it slow," Kurogiri said, "You're lucky you only have a concussion." Shigaraki didn't notice he was there. He willed the room to stop spinning before he spoke. What happened? His voice was dry even to his ears. You got knocked unconscious, Kurogiri replied helpfully. Obviously, Shigaraki asked the question he feared the answer to most. As sensei there, I am, came an unwavering voice from somewhere behind him. Shigaraki flinched and felt a wave of self-hatred at the response. Shigaraki was quick to apologize, explain, complain, and apologize again before getting cut off. You lost the Nomu and failed to confront All Might. Shigaraki had an, oh shit, moment of dread. He didn't realize they lost the Nomu too. But not to worry, we will have another opportunity. All for One said, and it was final. Tamura, you are a symbol of importance, and next time you will show the world the horror of your existence. When it was time to go back to school after the attack, Izuku had to do his best to calm his mother's nerves. She had been nothing but nervous the whole day before, and no amount of impromptu hugs or crying sessions had actually calmed her. One minute it seemed like she had it under control and ready to put the whole now infamous USJ attack in the past, but then the attack would be on the news for the 40th time in a day, and with every new piece of information Inko fretted that things were more serious than she previously suspected. I don't think something like that will happen again, Izuku reassured as he lingered in his mother's prolonged hug, both his and Baku's arms wrapped around her in what was supposed to be extra comforting. But I just don't like it. Even with all the pro heroes there, the school still got attacked. What if something happened? Luckily nothing happened. Everyone tried their best to fight back and everything turned out alright thanks to Baku. I suppose that's true, but I'm your mother, so of course I hate it. My poor baby, I know you were so brave. You must be seriously unlucky to have been there at all, but so lucky to get out safe. You know how much I don't like it, but I hope you'll be lucky enough to stay safe for the rest of the year and have a normal school experience. Or as normal of a school experience as he could at UA. Aizawa really set the standard of what a pro hero was when he walked in the next day wrapped in bandages and, completely unfazed by the questions being thrown at him, started talking about the upcoming sports festival. It was a big deal. Izuku and the entire nation knew that much. It was basically a national holiday, with every school and business taking the day off to watch. It was a strange feeling. For years Izuku had watched with unblinking eyes too afraid to blink and miss the action, and now that Izuku was here, really here, he would be competing. That hardened his resolve. No matter what, he'd try his best. He owed himself that much because now that he was living his dream, he had to seize every opportunity. Izuku was surprised when All Might came to him and pulled him aside at lunch. Izuku happily agreed, of course. It saved him from having to look for his mentor. They sat in their usual spot to eat their lunch, only All Might sighed and put his lunch down. I'm sure you noticed my absence from the excursion. That wasn't exactly planned. I should probably tell you. I may have pushed it a little further than I should have that morning. All Might was quick to explain in a regretful tone. Izuku remembered reading articles of All Might's activities that morning and nodded understandingly when All Might talked about his time limit. His mentor put it so plainly, but there was a great sense of grief behind the words. Somewhere inside Izuku could feel the delicate balance of times was shifting. Having grown up when All Might was an unstoppable force to be reckoned with, it just didn't feel right to know his powerful image was preceding him. Izuku hated to think what would happen if All Might stopped. Izuku didn't want that to happen. Couldn't let that happen. He didn't get to linger on those thoughts for long because All Might was quick to give him a sincere smile and praise him for his efforts. Because of you and your heroic actions, you ended the attack and saved your classmates and teachers' lives. I don't know if I was a hero, Izuku stressed. I wasn't really thinking actually. I just did it. He had a nagging feeling that he said that often. You did something. That makes you a hero, my boy. Some people can't react and it's up to those who can to protect. All Might sighed as he leaned forward. Everything is cleared thanks to Tsukauchi, and Baku is still our little secret, Midoriya. Well, at least the role you played is cleared up. We don't know much else. The teachers have discussed at length just exactly what went on during the attack, but to be honest, we don't know much more than the news knows. We only have speculations. I hope they go nowhere, but I have a feeling this might not be the last we hear from this group. The air was tense as Izuku nodded. Then All Might broke into a smile. So, how's One for All? Are you feeling more confident? I do feel a bit more confident. But not enough to be competent. I used it to escape some villains breaking any bones, but I wish I felt more confident. Well, that's progress. All Might sighed and looked wistfully outside the window. I hate to say it, but the symbol of peace is nearing its end. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but I'd be delusional to think that I can hog the spotlight forever. I'm lucky the attack played out how it did. Thanks to your actions, I didn't have to push it and cut down on my limit any further. I would hate to think what could have happened if the attack was prolonged. Izuku didn't want to imagine it. Those villains had come there with a plan. With a means to kill All Might, and Izuku put an end to it before they could even try. Well, Baku did, but he was a part of Izuku. A part of him that acted before he could think. Izuku supposed that Baku had to be a manifestation of his heroic spirit. The sports festival is coming up, my boy. This is your chance to announce yourself. In the future, you'll take the mantle as the symbol of peace. It will be up to you to uphold the faith society places on as heroes, and that's why at the sports festival I want you to announce yourself. Tell the world, I am here. I suppose my role now is investing as much wisdom and training as I can, so I'll have to help you become more confident. Izuku could feel the pressure mounting on him. It was intimidating but only strengthened his resolve. That's why he needed to make All Might tutor him after school again, so he could get One for All under control and be able to use it for the festival. Izuku wasn't surprised when it happened, or even that it did. After knowing Kacchan for so long, it was on brand with him to pick a fight with the other class and dismiss them at the same time. Izuku would have never considered doing that in a million years, and yet Kacchan just did it. Izuku clenched his teeth together as the stress mounted from the rising tensions. He really didn't like the aspect of conflict that was promised to come, and he just hoped it wouldn't divide the students. He had to use Baku to keep the aggravated extras, as Kacchan put it, at length, because he needed to find All Might and train. He only had a small window of time before the sports festival would arrive, and when Izuku was nervous, he doubled down in intensity. After some back and forth and head scratching from All Might, their training sessions had Izuku charging One for All to 100% and holding it before powering down. Izuku figured it would be like a muscle, and with enough exercising he could stretch and train it and slowly build up a tolerance. That's what he figured anyway. Izuku and All Might had training sessions, charging to 100% then holding and powering down. He knew by now that One for All could be localized in one area from when he leapt up and punched that giant 0-point robot, so in theory he'd have to practice with each limb. Izuku concentrated and powered each limb, slowly reaching 100% and slowly bringing it back down before going to the next limb. He didn't know if it was the best way to train, considering he could barely hold the power at 100%, but Izuku hoped it would force his body to adapt sooner. He supposed he should do the same with his fingers too. After his result from the ball throw test Aizawa had him do, Izuku had impressed himself and kept it in mind that it was more cost-effective than punching. Ruining one finger as opposed to a whole limb seemed like a no-brainer. If push came to shove and he was desperate during the festival, then he'd certainly have to rely on pushing One for All through his fingers if it meant clawing his way to victory. That's it, you'll have this under control in no time. All Might gave him a bright smile and thumbs up as Izuku rotated power from one limb to the next, rhythmically powering up and down. I still haven't figured out what Baku's ability is, Izuku said between heavy breaths as he continued to power up and hold the power pumping through his body. Picture the egg in the microwave. I think it's touch activated because of the design on his fingers. Focus now, All Might commanded. We'll have time to talk once you've done enough training for today. I can talk and train, Izuku insisted. If anything, it would make the training more effective because he had to strain harder to do both. Besides, if I'm going to be a hero, I'll need to do this with potentially worse distractions. I suppose that's true. Carry on. Right. I think it's touch activated, but I don't know that until something happens. I'll know what the ability is when something happens, but for now, I still need to discover that. Because right now, I don't know what the ability is, what it does, and if it affects people or objects. I'm not sure what to do because there's no comparison with quirks, since people don't really have to figure their quirks out from nothing because quirks are genetic and focus, All Might commanded. Right, sorry, egg in a microwave. So you've tried using Baku against objects? Yes, but nothing happens. Oh, right, I can feel something so I know it's working. Apparently, to use Baku's power I have to picture it or urge it. It's kinda like using One for All, but at least I can see One for All and I know what it does. I can see an aura around Baku when it's activated but nothing changes the object. All Might snapped his fingers as a great idea came to him. Use it against me. What? Luckily Izuku wasn't powered up at that moment, otherwise that could have been disastrous if he accidentally used it. All Might, you can't be serious. Come on, you said nothing changes. At least I'm not an object and can tell you how it feels. Yeah, sure nothing changes, but what if it's because it only works against people, so that's why nothing happened with objects and then something totally unexpected happens when I use it on you? What if something really bad happens, and since you're the symbol of peace and Midoriya, I'm a pro. I can take it. All Might puffed up into his beefy form and put his hands on his hips. Now do it. Izuku whimpered reluctantly as he fought with himself for a brief moment, before slowly sending Baku forward. Okay. Here goes, Izuku warned. Nothing. Well, I can feel Baku touching me, but don't keep me waiting. All Might chuckled. No, I did, but something had to have happened. Izuku tried over and over. Baku emitted a green aura, but again, nothing. I can't just have a nothing power. It must just be that I don't understand it yet, or maybe it's not in the right conditions. Oh, All Might cocked his head. It's disappointing, but maybe for the best. You should be training for the festival. You need to stand out and impress the world after all. I'll strike you a deal. How about you focus on what Baku can already do, and then we'll make sure you can use One for All by then. After that, we can put our heads together and figure out what's going on with Baku. Sound good? Izuku agreed. It wasn't that he was giving up on Baku's power, he was just giving it a rest. Maybe he'd have a stroke of inspiration when he wasn't searching for the answer. That's how these things usually worked, right? For the next few weeks, Izuku didn't have a moment of rest. Well, besides the required 8 hours of sleep. Besides his basic usual exercise, he trained with and without All Might. He's power to 100% before powering down. He was the egg in the microwave. He wasn't about to burst. He could breathe and think and move while at 100% and not paralyzed. But he just couldn't use it. It left him completely exhausted and drained beyond anything he felt before, which hopefully built up his stamina. It really was too bad All Might didn't know how to train him, since his mentor somehow adapted to the quirk so well compared to Izuku. But still, it was a start. He told himself that practice was progress. Once he mastered holding comfortably at 100%, he realized that he didn't immediately power to 100. He had to force it up, and what was stopping him from stopping short? At first, everything between 0 and 100 felt like a blur that couldn't be distinguished, but with some practice scaling it up and back, he found 50%. He practiced holding and pulling back 50% until he could pick it out in his sleep. He still felt wildly out of control and out of his depth, but he imagined he was exercising his quirk muscle. It would certainly be some time until he actually released any of the energy he could barely hold back. In theory, he could do this with any percentage. He just needed to become familiar with the gauge. But it was exhausting work. He had to schedule that sort of training for the end of the day, because otherwise he completely collapsed afterwards and was overcome by brain fog. Hopefully, that meant he was making progress, but it still felt like he was just straining his body. But even if his body ached the next day, it wasn't enough to stop him. Besides, one of the best qualities of a successful hero was adaptability, and thanks to Baku any task could be completed. Izuku could breeze through homework assignments with Baku holding the pen, all while Izuku worked out. He also kept up martial arts, watching videos upon videos and training both his and Baku's reflexes. As long as he memorized the move, it would be second nature for Baku. Only that he had to disguise it as his own move now, so Izuku needed to practice. He doesn't actively investigate Baku, but thinking about quirks, or just powers in general, came naturally to him, just like breathing. If he didn't train hard enough to fall asleep the second he collapsed in bed, he was thinking about Baku. Even if his stand's ability eluded him, Izuku still intended to make the most of Baku during the festival. The day of the festival came around quickly and all the weeks of preparation blended together into one big sweaty haze. But he had to admit, after giving it his all, Izuku couldn't feel any more prepared. He could hardly sit still as he got ready and ate breakfast, and as a result, he couldn't keep Baku still. His stand was humming with energy that matched how the user felt. Izuku could hardly hold still as Inko gave him a hug before school. "Good luck today, I'll be watching and cheering you on." "Thanks, but I really hope I don't have to rely on luck," Izuku chuckled, hugging his mother as he sent Baku to open the door for him so he could run straight out. I know, Inko cried. "You'll do your best. I'll be recording every second of it. Please just don't get hurt." "I'll try not to, I promise. They have healers there so you really don't have to worry, Recovery Girl is the best of the best. Just cheer me on, okay? I'll be doing my best. But it's my job to worry and cheer you on. No matter what, I'll be proud of you." If being in front of a live audience in front of thousands wasn't enough, the festival was being streamed to the entire nation. Not a single inch of the stadium was without a camera, and the volume of the crowd screaming drowned out his thoughts. It was both invigorating and like having a freezing bucket of water dumped on him. Because Izuku was here, he had made it. "I can't believe it," Izuku muttered to Baku, who floated above the crowd. "But I'm not sure how I can use you. I can't not use everything I have to my advantage, but I can't do anything that without you, especially in front of such a large crowd and so many cameras. I suppose I could use the overlap technique and pass you off as my quirk, but then if I use my actual quirk then there will be an obvious discrepancy between the two and I can't really use the quirk reliably anyway, not without destroying my body, so I'd have to save it for when it counts and somehow make everyone believe that the difference in power, that the strength is why it had an effect on my body." Izuku was temporarily distracted when Todoroki declared war on him. Todoroki wouldn't be the last. It was strange that after all this time someone like him was now seen as a worthy rival. It only fueled his determination to prove himself more and give his all. Shota Aizawa didn't have the energy to shift in the booth seat. Being forced into a rigid position by layers of bandages and casts left him with an ache far duller than sleep deprivation could ever achieve. But despite that, the only thing he was concerned about was using this opportunity to keep an eye on something that had been bothering him for some time. "Comfortable?" Hazashi asked as he fiddled with the equipment. "The drugs are doing their job," Shota dismissed as he searched among the students standing on the field as Bakugo was called to give an opening speech. "I should be able to pay enough attention to catch it should something happen. I just hope I don't miss anything. The screens are right here so you should have a front row seat to all the action," Hazashi exclaimed as he pointed to the extra cameras covering all the angles for them to comment on. "Do you need some more eye drops or something?" Shota had thoughts about Bakugo's demeanor. Hands in pockets and a sneer on his face. Shota would have to address it at some point because despite the boy's fierce potential, Bakugo needed to be refined and learn to cooperate. No man was an island and Bakugo wouldn't get far with such an abrupt attitude. It wasn't fair on the other students to have to overcompensate because Bakugo was too narrow-minded. That was proven correct with his statement of declaring himself the winner before the festival had even began. "Well, that's gonna get everyone riled up," Hazashi exclaimed, not really seeing the problem. "For better or worse, but it's just something I'll have to deal with later." Shota just sighed and he found his needle in a haystack of students. "And I can see fine. I just want a second pair of eyes." "On Midoriya, right," Hazashi said as realization crossed him. "This again. Are you sure you weren't just tired when it happened the first time?" The first time was during the apprehension test when somehow, despite Shota using erasure on him, Midoriya was able to bat away the capture weapon. Shota hated to reiterate this fact. "I was using erasure on him." "Okay, but not during the USJ incident." Shota had only just noticed it the second time in a blink and you miss it moment. Despite the blood loss, the head trauma and the strain to focus everything he had into using his quirk on Shigaraki, his highly trained peripheral vision had caught something. It took him a second to process it, and then a second later he was knocked unconscious. When he woke again in the hospital, he still remembered it as clear as day. All the quirks of the individuals there when Shigaraki reached for his student were accounted, yet for no apparent reason, the villain's hand was still forced down and his attack disarmed just in the nick of time. Just like what had happened on the first day of school, and the common factor was Midoriya. What made him certain that something was going on was the collective attempt to hide it. It wasn't just Midoriya who was in on it. Someone the police force had to be covering it up, because Shota had read the whole report and there was no mention of that little detail anywhere. There was a connection between Midoriya and someone powerful, someone who could sweep it under the rug. But who and why? Either annoyingly thorough or just playing devil's advocate to challenge Shota, Hazashi asked if Shota had the clearance to read the full report. That was to imply that maybe Shota didn't have the clearance to know about what was going on because something was going on. That implication only deepened the conspiracy, because the version that Shota had read while waiting to be discharged from the hospital had included everything he remembered until the moment the last villain was in handcuffs. As far as he was aware, everything was accounted for and there were no other details left out. Every little thing made sense and fit the greater picture. There had to be a conspiracy going on here. It didn't make sense if there was no conspiracy. Because of his logical ruse of expulsion on the first day of school, Midoriya had no reason to really give his all, unless he had a reason to hide something. A reason far bigger than Shota could imagine. Potentially even something dangerous if someone in the police force was backing it. There was a dismal chance that Midoriya and the police were both oblivious to it, but Shota had a feeling that wasn't the case. He had been over this at least twice with Hazashi, and now Shota was beginning to question why he confided in him to begin with. Hazashi seemed to sense Shota's tiring patience. Okay, I can't get distracted focusing on just one participant, that wouldn't be very groovy of me, ya dig? But if there was something going on, then I'm sure you'll notice it again. But can't you focus on captivating the audience with that insightful commentary of yours? Hazashi stretched out in his seat and watched Shota from the edge of his eye. Besides, this show's gonna be on air for weeks after this, you can just give it a rewatch later with those sharp eyes of yours. Fine, Shota sighed and relented the conversation. Rewatching later sounded like a more logical option, he had to admit that much. But I'll still be keeping an eye out. When the first event was announced, Izuku reluctantly put Baku away, just in case he automatically used him and gave away his advantage to either his competitors or the entire nation of Japan. If he was going to use Baku, then it would have to be a calculated choice. As it stood, Izuku thought he had a good chance of getting through the race without his stand. If only he kept his eyes peeled for opportunities. His faith in himself wasn't misplaced when Izuku got through the obstacle course easily enough by himself without aid up until the last moment. Izuku would like to say that thinking ahead by grabbing that robot part was what helped him win, but honestly, it was only luck that each dangerous gamble, one after another, paid off. He definitely needed Baku's aid to stick that landing as he propelled himself in the air with the use of the landmines, and he hated to think how it could have been really bad otherwise, even with Recovery Girl on standby. But it got him first place, which made him feel lighter than air, and his face hurt from smiling so big. But he started to feel the weight of it when it was announced that he was target number 1 for the next event. The second event was a cavalry battle, and luckily, he was able to put together a well-balanced team and had a fighting chance without Baku or One for All. He did keep reflexively bringing Baku out and in front of him whenever he had a close call. It was hard to fight down instinct. Images flashed through his mind of exactly what martial arts move he would play with Baku, and every time he had to catch himself before he acted on it. But there was some strategy in using Baku, especially when he could pass it off as a coincidence. When Todoroki went to grab the 1,000,000 points from Izuku's head, it just so happened that either Todoroki didn't pull hard enough or Izuku had tied it too tight, allowing him to bend away from his opponent's arm at an angle that should have made him fall, but didn't because of Baku's support. He was only just narrowly able to keep the points. Izuku did promise himself that no matter what, he had to hold on to these points. He did see a brief flash of fire that surprised him, but he brushed it away with a swipe from Baku. A blank look came across Todoroki's face as he stared at his own arm, completely lost. If it wasn't for his team, he may have even lost points as they navigated out of range just as Izuku reached for a headband. Then Todoroki's eyes were icy cold once again and Izuku didn't have time to analyze what just happened before the timer rang out. His team celebrated because somehow, against all odds they still had the 1,000,000 points and were in first place. Deku, can you believe this? We won. Uraraka cheered and accidentally made him float as she grabbed onto him in euphoric haste. I'm so sorry. It's because we're such a well-balanced team, Tokiyami commented and Dark Shadow gave a thumbs up. Izuku wondered what would happen if Baku touched Dark Shadow, but knew better than to try it. No, it's because of my babies. Hatsume vigorously corrected. Thank you for being the star that got my babies a chance to shine in the next event. Yeah, it's no problem. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck because he really didn't know what to say when the support student was just so straightforward. The only thing he could think about was that he had won again. They were in first, that he was in first, twice. Astronomical odds. Impossible odds, right? It seemed to impress everyone else as everyone from his class had nothing to say except congratulations. Well, the exception was Kacchan, naturally. Oi Deku. Kacchan ran over and leaned into his space with his hands tensed. Don't you think you'll win again? I'll kill you. You might think I'm fucking stupid and don't know shit because you've lied to me for years, but I don't need to know about your stupid quirk to beat you, damn it. Don't you dare make me look twice as stupid because I meant what I said in my speech. That translated to, Izuku would need to fight tooth and nail if he wanted to win because Kacchan wouldn't be letting up because, as he said in the opening speech, he was here to beat everyone. And it would be personal because Kacchan still thinks Izuku's a liar. Izuku just nervously chuckled and stole a glance at Baku as Kacchan stormed away. He does know we might not face each other, right? I mean, I guess it's possible, but we haven't fought since the battle trial, so maybe I'll just wait until I see the matches before I worry about coming up with a strategy. If I couldn't face against him and win, then I don't know if I could now. Somehow his stand seemed judgmental. Well, that doesn't mean I won't try. Shota tuned out Hisashi's hype for the current festival winner and the crowd that he riled up. Shota was more focused on thinking about the possibility of Midoriya winning 2 consecutive events. The odds weren't impossible if an event was suited for one's quirk and tenacity, but it still felt like it shouldn't be possible. Especially when he didn't see Midoriya use his quirk at all. Shota really was reading too much into this. But it was hard not to, especially when this conspiracy required a lot of mental consideration. It frustrated him that he had a loose understanding of his student's quirk because what Midoriya could and couldn't do wasn't strictly defined, not when he was still learning and evolving at such a steep rate. That meant there was a lot of plausible deniability if this was a result of Midoriya's quirk, or the conspiracy. Because Shota knew there was a conspiracy, and without that little piece of knowledge everything that Midoriya did would be overlooked because everything seemed to be so neatly tied together that no one had any reason to question anything. Except for Shota, who knew that Midoriya was somehow capable of resisting his erasure and moving things without even touching them. The capture weapon and the villain's hand, both an object and a living person which Midoriya had never come into contact with before yet somehow could control. Shota would assume it was the work of a quirk if it wasn't for Midoriya already having a registered quirk, one that should have been erased. Though for all intents and purposes, erased because Shota still remembered the look on his student's face as he blocked his power. Confirmed to have been blocked because that was how Midoriya made the connection to Shota's hero identity. Frustrating. This required a lot of overthinking. Shota was exhausted beyond words and could only drink coffee through a straw. Yet somehow this whole situation was more frustrating than his current physical state. Shota couldn't help but think of Midoriya's hasty landing in the first event. It almost seemed too lucky. If Midoriya had done something with whatever he was trying to keep hidden, it would have been then. It was too neat and perfect. Even if the boy was known to take risks, perhaps the reason for his constant risk-taking was because he knew he had something to fall back on. The cavalry battle was 15 minutes of chaos, and with a split attention he couldn't be sure of what Midoriya could do or if he did anything suspicious at all. With his quirk developing quickly as the student finally learned some control, Shota wouldn't know what he was looking for until he rewatched the festival in his own time and found it. It wasn't like he had anything else to do in his free time, being as injured as he was. Patrolling was out of the question and he was on top of his teaching duties. That left some time and effort to investigate a conspiracy that was slowly turning his brain to mush. Izuku was going to the cafeteria with his energetic classmates when Todoroki pulled him to the side, ignoring all questions from Izuku as he walked with purpose and brought him to a secluded hall. Just to stare at him. Izuku didn't doubt that something was happening and Todoroki was thinking of something, but without him saying it or talking, Izuku really didn't know what to do besides awkwardly waiting. "We should eat soon. The cafeteria will be busy," Izuku suggested. "You made me break my promise to myself. No one else could do that," Todoroki responded, the tone catching Izuku completely off guard. Which kickstarted a very awkward conversation when Izuku was suddenly accused of being All Might's secret child. Izuku thought he got out of that situation well enough, even if he rambled. He just wasn't expecting to hear that and he couldn't feel more embarrassed that his mentorship could be interpreted that way. But then that kickstarted a worse conversation. Todoroki was targeting him because Izuku reminded him of All Might and Todoroki's life as the child of the number 2 hero left Izuku with aching sympathy and the overwhelming urge to fix things and meddle when he had no business to. Then Izuku was left with tumbling thoughts as Todoroki strode away and before Izuku could really register what he was doing, Baku was grabbing Todoroki's shoulders. Todoroki whipped around and Izuku threw himself backwards with not too eloquent surprise as he blood froze. He could not out Baku. That was not a slip-up he could afford. Even at that speed, "I will still be able to beat you." Todoroki's eyes narrowed and Izuku mentally sighed at being given an out. "Right, yeah, sorry, Izuku paused and let his thoughts recede. He needed to make Todoroki see things differently because while his situation was terrifying, Todoroki deserved the same support that had allowed Izuku to get as far as he did. But that angle just wasn't going to work. "I'm coming at you with everything I have. I hope you can do the same." As expected of the sports festival, it had been eventful, in more ways than Izuku could predict. Learning about the shameful secrets of the number 2 hero hadn't been a possibility he considered that morning, but when Todoroki had approached him unprovoked and dumped excess amounts of delicate secrets, Izuku could only roll with the punches and do what he does best, plan. He was determined to help Todoroki in any way he could and that started with pointing out how his thinking was stupid and he had it all wrong. He was still mulling it over as the finalist competitors gathered for the start of the third round, which Izuku knew would be one-on-one battles before it was even announced. The third event was the same every year and Izuku couldn't feel prouder to have gotten this far. It was something he could only dream about and yet here he was. Izuku really wanted to see where he would end up after all of this and the curiosity turned into determination. "We've done our best to get here," Izuku muttered to his stand, "but I know we can get further. Let's do our best to get as far as we can." That sentiment was reinforced when he saw the brackets. If he passed the first round, there was a chance he would be up against Todoroki. Well, not chance, Izuku needed to pass. He knew Todoroki would. There were a few bumps on the road to the third event beginning when 2 contestants dropped out, both for the same reason. Neither felt like they had truly earned their spot. Izuku didn't really agree with it or their reasoning, but he had to respect it. It was easy to stop giving it thought when he realized he would be fighting first and he needed a strategy. His opponent was about to talk to him when Ojiro pulled him aside with urgency. That's when he explained just exactly what happened during the second event, giving Izuku some very important knowledge on his opponent's quirk. Brainwashing, activated by replying and deactivated either through the will of the user, or through the victim being bumped and somehow woken up. Izuku couldn't rely on being bumped by a third party. He cocked his head as he considered Baku. His stand cocked his head back. Too dangerous if someone notices. But if I slip up at least I might have a way out. Izuku muttered, "I'll just have to do my best to ignore Shinso." Despite Ojiro giving him a heads up on his opponent, Izuku couldn't help but mentally facepalm when he gave into Shinso's taunting. Now he was brainwashed and stuck in a trance, like a fog so thick he couldn't see his own hand. If he had more of his mind, Izuku would find it cool to see and experience the effects of this quirk firsthand, but the lingering feeling of snap out of it was more persistent. Izuku quickly focused on fighting his way back into the match and trying to resist a will being imposed on him that wasn't his own. He couldn't concentrate, but he didn't need to when Baku was second nature. Izuku may have lost his body, but he hadn't lost his mind or fighting spirit. There was a nagging feeling that he wasn't the only one in his mind urging him to break free. It should have made him feel something because the idea of it should be unsettling, but Izuku felt strangely comfortable at the feeling. Forming Baku was a little more strenuous than usual, but within a second his stand was in front of him and rammed into his chest, knocking his head back and sending a shock down his spine. Just as Izuku snapped from the hold Shinso had on him, he saw something he couldn't quite describe but just knew was one for all. He pushed that aside for the remainder of the match. He could bring it up with all might once his victory was secured. With Baku's body overlapping his own, Izuku ran with clenched teeth as Shinso sneered desperate sentiments, trying to bait Izuku to respond, unknowing Izuku could relate more than anyone. Izuku dragged Shinso from the area. Baku's borrowed strength was necessary because his opponent just wouldn't stop fighting. Izuku won the match and he stood at the edge of the arena with heaving breath and a feeling of enlightenment. Unfortunately, there was nothing he could say to his opponent, whose relatable drive in the face of such disadvantage was nothing short of inspirational. Fortunately, Izuku didn't need to say anything, not when the crowd said it for him. Maybe one day if Shinso joined the hero course, Izuku could ask him more questions, maybe some weird ones too, about his quirk. He hoped that wasn't just hopeful thinking. Out of all the bizarre things that had been happening to him in the past year, a haunted quirk wasn't something he imagined. Vestiges of past users sounded interesting, and All Might didn't even blink when a floating notebook took notes on Izuku's behalf and updated one for All's profile. All Might's words were still being considered in his brain as Izuku returned to his seat with his other notebook, now eager to catch the rest of the matches. Each match came and went, and either it played out like he expected or he learned something new to add to his notebook. One thing that was very important he learned was just what Todoroki was capable of. He watched as Zero became a speck in a giant mountain of ice. Well, at least Izuku knew what to expect and what he would have to counter in his next match. Because he would be facing Todoroki, who looked strangely sad as he thawed Zero out. More matches came and went, but when Tokiyami stepped up, Izuku was hit with the realization that Dark Shadow really seemed to resemble a stand. He didn't know why he didn't make that connection earlier. Without wasting a second, Baku snatched his other notebook about stands for him, and Izuku balanced both on his lap as his mind quickly rationalized. Obviously, Dark Shadow wasn't a stand. Everyone was able to see it, instantly ruling out the possibility. But it still behaved like one. Separate from the body but moving in accordance with the will of its user. Even if it wasn't a stand, Izuku was determined to gather as much inspiration as possible. Hopefully, any ideas he notes about Dark Shadow would have applicable uses for Baku. In fact, he really should ask Tokiyami how he uses Dark Shadow. It's incredibly versatile and made Tokiyami formidable, save for the weakness issue with light, which Baku was immune to. Maybe Izuku could even have some pointers for Tokiyami, like if it was possible to overlap Dark Shadow with his body like Izuku did with Baku. Izuku really needed to talk to Tokiyami. Izuku was a little disappointed when the match didn't last too long, but at least Tokiyami would appear again in another round. He did feel bad for Momo, no doubt frustrated with herself. She worked so hard to get to the third part of the sports festival and it was over before she could even think. I really hope the pros aren't going to watch me like how you watch these matches, Uraraka said nervously beside him, and Izuku realized he was mumbling, now I'm going to overthink everything. So sorry. Izuku scrambled to apologize. Great, now he made her nervous. It's okay, really, I'm still not going to hold back. I need to do my best and give it my all. That's right, Uraraka was going up against Kacchan. Izuku wasn't the one fighting him, but even he was nervous because he knew Kacchan wouldn't hold back. Izuku offered his help as he searched through his notebook for anything that could help. He didn't really have a plan, but he had half ideas and information only for Uraraka to turn it all down. It turned out Uraraka didn't need anything Izuku had to offer. Her plan was certainly more impressive than anything he could have thought of. It seemed like she had won until Kacchan pulled out a move bigger than Izuku had ever seen, and having put everything into her plan until then, Uraraka was done. Izuku's hand moved as fast as he could as he updated Kacchan's quirk abilities in the notebook, before running to see Uraraka. "I'm fine," she insisted for the fourth time as he and Iida checked in on her. "Really? I tried my best and now I'm all healed up. I'll be fine to come and cheer you guys on. I'm glad to hear it and I am impressed by your strategy," Iida shouted, if only just. He apologized much quieter when Recovery Girl reminded him of his volume. "I'm really impressed too. I had to admit that's a better plan than I could come up with. Maybe he'll have to come to Uraraka for ideas if he faced off against Kacchan." But he didn't want to get ahead of himself, he still had to get through to Todoroki first. Before he knew it, he was going to his next match, and every time he tried to focus on his plan, something happened. First, it was Kacchan, surprising him as he came around a corner, and Baku was quickly put up as a defense. One that Izuku forced himself to relax when Kacchan confronted him for apparently giving Uraraka ideas. When Izuku informed him that it was all Uraraka, Kacchan said nothing and promptly walked off with a contemplative face. A strange interaction. Izuku chalked it up to Kacchan being tired out from the match. It didn't escape his notice how the other walked with a slightly more pronounced hunch and was massaging his wrists. "Shouldn't you go to Recovery Girl? Fuck off. I'll be just fine," Kacchan snapped, his earlier contemplation gone. Izuku would just have to take his word for it and kept walking. Just as he got back into thinking about his game plan, he was confronted again. This time when Baku jumped out, Izuku had to restrain himself from using the stand to do something offensive rather than defensive. It was hard not to feel cornered as the heat of Endeavor's flames could be felt mere inches from where his protective and wary stand hovered. Izuku distantly realized that the nervous energy he had when face to face with a revered hero was starkly absent. Once upon a time Izuku thought he could never know enough about his favorite heroes, and now that was proved wrong when knowing too much made him feel sick. The country's number 2 hero trafficked a woman for her quirk and abused his son like he was some mere tool or extension of self. Nothing about that was heroic. Izuku did not admire Endeavor anymore. He didn't even want to be around the man. But the man wouldn't let him pass. "Your quirk is comparable to All Might's," Endeavor said with narrowed eyes. "If Shoto can beat you, then you'll sever as a stepping stone for him to one day beat All Might. So don't you dare hold back so my masterpiece can win this stupid festival and set himself apart from the crowd of wannabes." Izuku just stared for a moment as held Baku rigidly in place. At least Endeavor didn't assume he was All Might's son. "I won't be holding back," Izuku said, voice level as he stepped past Endeavor. "And that may be true. Todoroki will one day be capable of beating All Might. But he's not you. Anything that he accomplishes, it's him." Izuku didn't drop Baku as he walked away. Once he was out of sight he felt a wave of awkwardness shake him. "I can't believe I just said that," Izuku confided in his stand. "But I can't believe that he can be a hero after all he's done. I mean, sure, he's helped a lot of people, but he's also hurt people he never should've." The awkwardness was gone and Izuku wished he had said more. Questioned more and asked Endeavor if he saw anything wrong with what he did. That strengthened his determination. Izuku couldn't even think about winning until he helped Todoroki break free from the oppressive force that was his father. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.